Hey there and welcome back. If you are settling in now, perhaps drawing the covers a little higher, letting the small frets of the day loosen their hold, letting the room soften around you, letting the breath you have been holding, without quite realizing it, ease its way out, letting the muscles of the jaw and the shoulders and the small place behind the eyes begin gently to release. Good. Because tonight is a story about being the diamond of the season. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? And if you enjoy these cozy journeys through history, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Whether you're here to drift into sleep or to follow the currents of history, I'm glad you're with me. This is the story of what happens when, for one strange spring of your life, you become the young woman an entire city decides to talk about. Not just admired, not just approved of. The one whose name is in every drawing room before breakfast. The one whose dress at last night's ball is being described in considerable detail by women you have never met, in houses you have never entered, over teacups in rooms whose curtains are still drawn at 10:30 in the morning. The one who, when she walks into a crowded room, causes a small, involuntary turning of heads that runs along the walls like a current of air. The one whose gloved hand, when she sets it down on the silk of a banquet in the supper room, is observed for the small details of its placement, in the way that paintings are observed, by people who will, in the carriages going home, remember exactly what she did. Tonight you are not a debutante, or rather, you are, technically, still a debutante, but you are something else as well. Something the rest of London has, in the last fortnight or so, agreed upon almost without conferring. You have become, in the language of the era, a diamond of the first water, an incomparable, the reigning toast, the phrase that modern audiences will know best. The diamond of the season came into popular usage rather later than 1814, and was really fixed in place by 20th and 21st century fiction, looking back at this world with the affection of distance. But the phenomenon it describes was entirely real. Every spring in Regency London, out of the 100 or so young women coming out for the first time, 2 or 3 were elevated above the rest by some loose collective verdict of the patronesses, the matrons, the gossip columns, and the dandies in the bow window of White's, and were treated thereafter, for the duration of that one particular season, as the women whose presence at any given event determined whether the event itself had been a success. The hostess who could announce the diamond's arrival could rest easy. The hostess whose ball was held on a night the diamond was elsewhere had a problem on her hands. That is what has happened to you. And what I want to do tonight is to walk through it slowly, in the careful detail it deserves, because the experience of being singled out in this very particular way is not, as it sometimes appears in retrospect, the simple confection of glamour and admiration that the films and novels make it look. It is in its actual lived texture considerably more strange, more isolating, more exhausting, more uncertain, more layered with private costs that the public surface of it does not show, and in some ways more interesting than the more conventional debutante experience that almost everyone else of your age this spring is having. Tonight I want to take you slowly through what it actually felt like, hour by hour, day by day, ball by ball, to be the young woman that 1814 had elected, by some unspoken process whose mechanics no one entirely understood, to talk about. So let me set the scene. The year is 1814, and what a year it is to be coming out. Napoleon has just abdicated for the first time, in April, and is on his way to a small island in the Mediterranean called Elba, which it is widely assumed will be his final residence. The long war that has shaped your entire childhood, that took your eldest brother into the army at 17 and your second cousin into the navy at 14, that made the price of bread go up and the price of muslin, price of almost everything go up, has for the moment paused. The men who have spent years away on the peninsula, or in the Mediterranean, or on the long blockade of the French coast are coming home. Officers in regimentals are appearing at evening parties for the first time in years, The mood in London this spring is, by every contemporary account, almost giddy. There has not been a season like this in living memory. You do not know it yet, but the spring of 1814 will turn out to be even more remarkable than its opening week suggested. In June, the Allied sovereigns will arrive in London. The Tsar of Russia, Alexander, will come, with his sister the Grand Duchess Catherine, who has already been in town for some weeks and has been making her own considerable impression on the social scene. The King of Prussia, Frederick William, will come. Field Marshal Blucher, the old Prussian general whose cavalry charges have become a kind of household phrase by the end of the war, will come. The Austrian Foreign Minister, Metternich, will come. The whole victorious coalition will be in London together, simultaneously, for the better part of 3 weeks, and the Prince Regent will be hosting them with the kind of extravagance that only he could authorize. The streets will be lined with cheering crowds. The papers will be full of nothing else. The great houses of Mayfair will be holding events in their honor at a pace that will exhaust even the most energetic society, and he will be at many of these events, because the diamond of the year 1814 is, by definition, a young woman whom the great hostesses wish to have in their rooms when the Tsar of Russia comes to dine. The piece will turn out to be premature. Napoleon will return from Elba within 12 months, and the whole thing will end definitively only at Waterloo in June of the following year, but you do not know that yet. What you know is that London this spring is going to be brilliant, full, expensive, and if your mother is right about your prospects, possibly the most consequential few months of your life so far. The Prince Regent presides over all of this. That is George, the eldest son of King George III, the king who has been declared unfit to rule because of the recurring illness that has gradually overtaken his mind. The regent has been ruling in his father's name since 1811, and his court is, by reputation, the most extravagant the capital has seen in a generation. He is a man of enormous appetites, considerable taste, and very little discipline. The pavilion at Brighton, that strange and beautiful palace with its onion domes and its endless connected rooms, is being built and rebuilt according to his vision. He is, in his way, the spirit of the era that will eventually bear his name, and whether or not you ever meet him personally, and at the highest levels of society you might, briefly, in passing, his presence shapes everything about the world you are about to enter. The court at Carlton House sets the tone for the rest of the city. The regent's friendships and his enmities, his appetites and his aversions, ripple outward through the network of fashionable society, and reach you eventually, in the form of which gentlemen pursue you, and which decline to do so, which hostesses receive your mother, and which find themselves regrettably away from town when she calls. The diamond in this world is not exactly a position. There is no formal investiture. There is no document signed. No one tells you at any specific moment that you have become it. The verdict forms itself in the way verdicts always formed themselves in Regency society, which is to say through 1,000 small private remarks made over 1,000 teacups in 1,000 drawing rooms over the course of about 10 days, until at some point the consensus has hardened into something resembling fact, and the consequences of the consensus begin to make themselves felt in the form of the cards on the salver, the invitations on the mantelpiece, the gentleman riding alongside the carriage in the park. You did not at the time know that anything unusual had happened. You went home in the carriage with your mother in the small hours of the morning. You slept badly. You woke late, and it was around 11 the next morning, when the cards began to arrive on the silver tray in the front hall, that the first faint sense of something out of the ordinary made itself known. There were a great many cards, not the usual 2 or 3, the customary morning calls from the women of your mother's generation who knew her from before her marriage. There were dozens. The footman set them down in a small fan-shaped arrangement on the salver, and your mother, when she came down to look at them, paused for a moment that was not quite a smile, but was something. She picked up the cards one at a time. She read the names. She placed them in 3 small piles, sorting in a way that you had not, before that morning, fully understood she could sort. The first pile was the cards from women she had known all her adult life, The friends from her own debutante year, the cousins by marriage, the wives of her husband's old school fellows. The second pile was the cards from women she knew only formally, women with whom she had previously exchanged perhaps 3 or 4 cards in the entire course of her London life, women whose presence on her morning salver this particular morning was in itself a small kind of news. The third pile, and this was the smallest and the one she handled with the most care, was the cards from women whose names she had never expected to see on her salver at all, women whose social position was such that calling on your family was not a thing they would have considered doing a fortnight ago. And when she had finished sorting, she looked at you briefly, with an expression that combined satisfaction and concern in roughly equal measure, and said only, "Well, that was the morning the situation declared itself. By the afternoon the drawing room was full. By the evening your dance card for the next Wednesday at Almack's was filled before you had even left the house. By the end of the week the columns of fashionable intelligence in the Morning Post were carrying references to a young lady recently come out who had created, in the words of the columnist, no small sensation in the highest circles of the town. Your name was not, of course, given. The Morning Post did not print the names of unmarried young women in connection with social news, except in the briefest formal announcements of their having been presented at court or being engaged to be married. But the description was specific enough that any of your acquaintance who read it would know within seconds exactly who was meant. There was a phrase about the colour of your gown at the previous Wednesday's ball at Almack's. There was a phrase about the family connection that had brought you up to town. There was a phrase about the patroness who had been particularly attentive to you in the supper room. The columnist had not been at the ball, of course. The columnist had been told by some intermediate chain of informants exactly what to write. By the end of the second week of the season, when your mother went out for her morning calls, she was being received with a kind of attention that was new. Drawing rooms quieted slightly when she was announced. Conversations she had been carrying on for years with the same matrons over the same teacups became subtly different conversations with subtly different undercurrents. Something had shifted in your family's position in the world, and the shift was being signalled in the small 1,000 ways that Regency society had developed for signalling such things in every house in town. This is the moment I want to settle into, because I think one of the things that gets least understood about being elevated in the way you have been elevated is how unprepared for it the elevation finds you. You did not know before you came out that this was a possible outcome. Your mother had hoped for a respectable season, had hoped for 1 or 2 creditable offers, had hoped that you would be received pleasantly at Almack's, and would dance enough at the major balls to suggest that you were a young woman of acceptable accomplishments and pleasant disposition. Neither of you had been planning for what has now happened. The vocabulary, the strategies, the particular kinds of vigilance required for managing this kind of attention, all of these are things you are now having to develop in real time, while the attention itself is happening, with no opportunity to step back and prepare. Your mother, who is otherwise a very competent woman, has had to write urgent letters to her own elder sister, a viscountess of some standing who has been through a season at this level once before with her own eldest daughter, asking for advice about how to manage what is now happening. The advice, when it comes back, is detailed, careful, slightly amused at the speed of events, and slightly anxious about the costs to come, for there are costs. The whole apparatus of being the diamond, before we go any further into its texture, requires resources that your family had not necessarily anticipated needing to deploy. The wardrobe that had seemed adequate at the start of the season is suddenly inadequate, because the diamond cannot be seen in the same gown twice in any room where anyone of consequence has previously seen her in it. And the rooms in which you are being seen are now considerably grander and more numerous than they were planned to be. The dressmaker is being visited twice a week. The milliner is being sent for. The ribbon merchant in Bond Street is sending round samples in the mornings. The carriage horses are being rested less frequently than they should be, because the carriage is required at more events. The candles in the drawing room are burning down faster than they were budgeted for. The cook is producing more cake. The footman is wearing out his shoes. The whole household is, very quietly, operating at a tempo above its usual rate, and the bills, which your father will see at the end of the quarter, will reflect this. He will pay them. Of course he will. A father whose daughter has been elevated to this position cannot economize without sending precisely the wrong signal to the world. But he will, in his study, have a quiet conversation with his man of business about the limits of how long this rate of expenditure can be sustained, and the conversation will be sober, and the answer will not, in most families, be cheerful. Let me give you some sense of what the attention actually consisted of in the practical day-to-day texture of the season, because I think one of the underrepresented aspects of the Diamond's experience is how completely it occupied her hours. There was simply no time in her life for anything that was not the season. The schoolroom phase had at least had quiet afternoons, the long hours with a book in the window seat, the walk in the garden with a sister or a friend. The early season, before the elevation, had been busy but manageable, with stretches of relatively unstructured time. The Diamond season had no such stretches. From the moment she woke late, with the particular dryness of mouth and slight ache behind the eyes that came from having gone to bed at 4 a.m, until the moment she returned in similar condition the next morning, every hour was claimed. In the mornings, the cards continued to arrive. Where a normal debutante might receive 4 or 5 morning callers in the course of a typical week, you were receiving 15 or 20 in a single day. The drawing room was permanently in a state of being arranged. The fresh flowers had to be ordered in greater quantities, in particular kinds, in arrangements that suggested the family was continuing to manage everything correctly. The cook had to keep more cake and biscuits than she had previously kept on standby, because there might be visitors at any hour between 11 and 4. The footman, who had previously had a relatively quiet morning routine, was now opening the door, taking cards, announcing names, opening the door again, and showing the previous visitors out, in a continuous loop that lasted from late morning until early afternoon. He was given an additional shilling a week to acknowledge the increase in his work, but he would have done it without the shilling, because being the footman of a Diamond's family was a position of some interest in the servants' hall network of London, and the gossip he could carry to the public houses where the upper servants gathered in the evenings was, for that one season, exceptionally good. The maids, similarly, found themselves the centre of more attention than usual when they went on their afternoon errands. The housekeeper at one of the great houses might be unusually warm when she met them at the back door. The lady's maid of a great matron might have a few words for the Diamond's lady's maid that, while not exactly indiscreet, were rather more cordial than they had previously been. The whole household, in this sense, was experiencing the elevation, not just the Diamond at the centre of it. The visitors themselves fell into categories that your mother began, very rapidly, to distinguish between. There were the genuine well-wishers, women of her own generation who were pleased on her behalf, and who came to offer the kind of warm congratulations that long friendships make possible. These were the visits she most enjoyed. They were also the visits that were, in some sense, the most precious to her, because they were among the few unmediated by calculation. Her oldest friend in town, a woman she had known since they were both 17, came one afternoon and sat with her in the drawing room and said simply, "My dear, how proud you must be," and the two of them, for one quiet half-hour, had a real conversation in the way that real conversations between long friends were possible. The half-hour was, in retrospect, one of the things your mother remembered most clearly from the entire season. It was unscripted, it was unhurried, it was warm. There were not many such half-hours in those weeks. There were the more ambiguous visitors, women who had not previously called and who were calling now precisely because of your changed status, who came to assess and to position themselves, who would be useful or not depending on how the season unfolded. These visits required your mother to be careful, polite, neither too warm nor too cool, neither too pleased nor too modest. The visits had to be returned, of course, There was an entire reciprocal economy of cards left and cards returned that had its own elaborate timetable, and your mother spent considerable time consulting her engagement book and consulting her sister-in-law and consulting the small notebook in which she was now keeping records of who had called when and what they had said. The notebook was new. She had not previously needed one. There were the rivals' mothers, the women whose own daughters were also out this year, who came in a spirit of cool civility that was not quite a hostility, but was certainly not warmth, who watched everything in the drawing room with eyes that were taking inventory. These visits were the ones your mother found most tiring. She had to maintain a particular kind of composure that did not give the visitor anything to take away. The drawing room had to be perfect. The conversation had to be light. You had to be present and visible and pleasant, without being any of those things in a way that could be reported back as having been showy or proud. These were the visits in which your mother was most likely, after the visitor had left, to sit down on the sofa for a few minutes with her hand pressed against her forehead before resuming the day. There were the chaperones of marriageable young men, the mothers and aunts of the gentlemen whose names were now being mentioned in connection with yours, who came to look at you in person and to form a private opinion about whether the rumours of your suitability were accurate. These were perhaps the most consequential visits of all. The grandmother of a particular eligible young earl had her own ideas about whom her grandson ought to marry, and her opinion would weigh heavily in his eventual decision, and her visit to your drawing room on the Thursday afternoon of the third week of the season was therefore an event whose significance your mother understood completely. She had the room arranged. She had the right cake on the table. The grandmother stayed for the full half-hour that civility required. She drank her tea. She asked you 3 carefully phrased questions. She left without giving any indication of what she thought. Your mother, after she had gone, sat down and said only, "Well, we shall see." And in fact, in the fullness of time, the grandmother's verdict turned out to have been favourable, but you would not know that. For some weeks, there was occasionally a visitor from a level of society slightly above your own, a woman whose visit was itself an honour, whose presence in the drawing room could be communicated in subsequent conversations as a kind of confirmation that yes, the Diamonds family was now a family one called on. These visits your mother received with particular care. She had her best gown ready. She had the second best tea service brought down. She had the fire built up. She managed, in the course of the visit, to refer twice to the visitor's eldest son, who was making a name for himself in the diplomatic service, in the kind of complimentary way that suggested familiarity without intrusion. The visit went well. The visitor stayed slightly longer than the minimum required. The card she left on the salver was kept, after the visit, in a small dish on the mantelpiece in your mother's morning room, where it would be visible to subsequent visitors as a quiet sign of who was now calling on the family. Your mother did not, of course, make any reference to it. She did not need to. The card was the reference. You were expected to be in the drawing room for all of this, to be present, to be visible, to be agreeable, to make the kind of pleasant, unspecific conversation that gave nothing away while suggesting by your manner that you were exactly the kind of young woman the rumours said you were. You were expected to do this for hours, 5 days a week, while also preparing for the evening's ball, planning the next day's wardrobe, fitting in the morning ride in Hyde Park, and getting whatever sleep you could in the few hours between the end of one event and the beginning of the next. The season was demanding for all debutantes. For the Diamond, the season was something closer to a sustained athletic performance under conditions of constant observation with no rest periods built in. Your maid, Sarah, who had come up to London with you and who was the closest thing you had to a confidant in the entire establishment, had taken to bringing you a small cup of strong beef tea in the late afternoon on the days when there was a ball that evening, because she had observed that without it you were beginning to look slightly thinner than the cut of your gowns required, and the dressmaker had only just made adjustments to accommodate the previous loss of weight. The beef tea was a small private kindness that no one else in the household knew about. You drank it standing at the window of your bedroom, looking down at the street. In the quiet quarter of an hour before the dressing began, I want to spend a moment with the dressing, because the dressing was, in some sense, the most laborious daily ritual of the diamond season, and the part of the experience that has been least preserved in the historical record. Modern accounts focus on the gown, the slippers, the gloves, the fan, the ostrich plumes, the small piece of jewellery that completed the effect. They tend to skip over the labour that was required to produce the effect. The labour was considerable. The dressing for a major evening at Olmax or at one of the great private balls took, from start to finish, about 2.5 hours. It began with the bath. In the small hip bath that Sarah brought into the dressing room with the help of one of the housemaids, the water was carried up in cans from the basement kitchen and was warm by the time it arrived at the dressing room door. The bath was poured. The lavender oil was added. The small fire in the dressing room grate was built up so that you would not catch a chill. You bathed quickly. The bath was not a place to linger. The whole apparatus of the dressing was waiting for you to be ready for it. Then there was the dressing of the hair. This was the longest part of the process, and the part that required the most skill on Sarah's part. The hair had to be brushed out from its daytime arrangement until it shone. Then it had to be rebuilt in whatever the prevailing fashionable arrangement was for that particular spring, with the small additional ornaments worked in among the curls. In 1814, the fashionable arrangement was a high crown of curls at the back, with smaller curls at the front above the brow, with a band or fillet of pearls or of velvet across the head, and with the ostrich plumes set into the back arrangement at the height that was correct for the formality of the occasion. For Olmax, 3 plumes; for a court presentation, more; for a private ball, the number depended on the ball. Sarah had a small notebook in which she kept record of what was correct for each event, and consulted it before she began the hair, and consulted it again part-way through to make sure she was getting the height of the plumes right. The hair, when it was finished, was held in place by a forest of small pins that Sarah had practiced inserting until she could do it without looking at her hands. You had learned in your first month in town not to touch it once it had been done. To touch it was to risk a curl coming loose. To have a curl come loose during the carriage ride to the ball was a small disaster that Sarah might or might not be able to repair in the carriage, depending on the lighting. The hair, once done, had a certain quality of architectural completion that the rest of the day's grooming did not have. It was finished. It had to remain so until the small hours of the morning, when it would be taken down again with the same patience with which it had been put up. After the hair came the dressing itself. The corset was tightened by Sarah to the degree that the gown required. The corsets of 1814 were not the wasp-waisted devices of later in the century. They were softer, longer, smoother under the high-waisted gown, designed to give a gentle compression rather than a dramatic shaping. But they still required tightening. You held the bedpost. Sarah pulled. The breath went out of you in the way it always did when the laces drew firm and you refound it slowly in the way you always did. Then the petticoat, then the gown itself lifted carefully over your head so as not to disturb the hair, settled onto the shoulders, the sleeves drawn carefully through, the back fastened with the small hooks that Sarah had practiced on. The gown was white, or near white. Most of your gowns this season were. The small details of the trimming, the embroidery, the ribbon, the lace were what distinguished one from another. Tonight's was the one with the small silver embroidery at the hem and the pale blue ribbon at the bodice. It had been made by Mrs. Bell in Charlotte Street in the second week of May and was being worn for the 3rd time that season. After the gown came the slippers. White silk with small rosettes at the front, made by a shoemaker in the Burlington Arcade who specialised in dancing slippers and whose work was considered the best in London for that particular purpose. The slippers fitted exactly. They had been made to the dimensions of your foot from a tracing taken at the start of the season, and they did not pinch, slip. They would not, however, survive the evening. Dancing slippers in 1814 were not designed to be worn more than once or twice. The soles were thin enough to allow the foot to feel the floor of the ballroom, and they wore through quickly. By the time you returned home in the small hours, these slippers would have small holes in the soles and would be discarded. There would be a fresh pair for the next ball. The shoemaker in the Burlington Arcade was, that season, doing rather better than usual. After the slippers came the gloves, long, white, kid, fastened with small buttons at the wrist. The gloves were the part of the costume that you spent the most time fidgeting with, in the small unobserved moments between the dressing and the departure for the carriage. They had to be smooth. They were used once, like the slippers, and replaced. The maid who brought them up from the glove drawer brought them on a small silver salver in pairs with the small twist of tissue paper between them. After the gloves came the fan, the reticule, the small piece of jewellery, and the shawl. The fan in 1814 was a more modest object than it had been 20 years before. The folding fan with the painted scene was no longer the height of fashion, replaced by simpler and smaller designs that suited the lighter classical aesthetic of the gowns. The reticule, the small drawstring bag that hung from the wrist, contained the smelling salts in their small enamelled bottle, the small clean handkerchief, the dance card with its tiny attached pencil, and possibly a small calling card for any unexpected emergency. The piece of jewellery was almost always small. A single pearl, a locket, a simple gold chain. The diamond was not expected to wear large ornaments. The fashion of the era and the convention for unmarried women required that the gown itself and the bearing of the wearer were the ornaments. The shawl was for the carriage, to be removed in the cloakroom on arrival. When all of this was assembled, when Sarah had stepped back and looked at you and made the small final adjustments to the plumes and to the way the gown hung at the back, you were ready. You stood in front of the long mirror in the dressing room. You looked at yourself. You did not, in those small moments, feel like a diamond. You felt, more often than not, slightly tired, slightly hungry, slightly nervous, and rather more aware than you had been an hour ago of the small things that might go wrong over the course of the evening to come. The young woman in the mirror was dressed for a particular kind of public appearance. The young woman doing the looking behind your eyes was a different person, and the gap between the two was, by this stage in the season, becoming a familiar small ache. Sarah, who had been doing this for you for 6 weeks now, knew the look on your face that came in those final minutes before you went down to the carriage. She did not, on the whole, comment on it. She would occasionally hand you a small glass of cold water, or move a single curl by a fraction of an inch, or smooth the back of the gown one last time. The kindnesses were small, but they were there. You were grateful for them in a way you did not say out loud. The relationship between a Regency lady and her lady's maid was a particular thing. It was structured by class, by employment, by the fundamental inequality of the household. But it could also be, in the right cases, the closest thing to honest companionship a young woman of your situation had access to, and Sarah was, by the standards of her profession, an excellent maid. You would, in the years to come, take her with you when you married. She would stay with you until the births of your first 3 children, when she would marry the head groom at your husband's estate in Hertfordshire and leave service to keep her own house. You did not know any of that yet. What you knew, in the small minutes before going down, was that she was there, and that her presence in the dressing room had become, without your having quite intended it, one of the things that made the rest of the evening possible. In the afternoons, after the calls had ended and before it was time to dress for the evening, you went out for the carriage drive in Hyde Park, every day, without exception, because not to be seen in the park between 5 and 7 was to invite speculation, and speculation, in your situation, was something to be managed rather than encouraged. The drive itself was, in its way, the strangest part of the daily routine. You sat in the open carriage with your mother. The horses walked slowly around the circuit of Rotten Row and the surrounding paths. You acknowledged, with a small inclination of the head, the dozens of acquaintances whose carriages passed yours. You waved with appropriate restraint at the gentleman who rode alongside on horseback to exchange a few words. You were, in essence, on display in motion, for 2 hours every afternoon, in a setting designed entirely for the purpose of being looked at by other people who had also come there to look and be looked at. The park in those hours was not a park in any meaningful sense. It was an extension of the drawing room and the ballroom, with the same audiences, the same assessments, the same continuous quiet judgment. It was, you sometimes thought, the most public way in which the unwritten work of being a diamond was conducted. The drawing rooms were private, in a sense. Only the people who had been received saw what happened inside them. The park was open. Anyone with a carriage or a horse or a pair of decent boots could be there, and the diamond's appearance there was a thing the whole of fashionable London could observe. The men who rode alongside your carriage were, in the official language of the season, paying their respects. In the actual language of what was happening, they were registering their interest, signalling their availability, and putting down a marker that would be remembered when, later in the season, the question of who would actually offer for you would begin to crystallize. Some of them you knew quite well by this point in the season. Others you had only spoken to once or twice. A few were riding alongside the carriage of a diamond purely because of a diamond was, in itself, a thing one did, regardless of any particular intention toward her. They wanted to be seen by their friends as the kind of man who could ride alongside that carriage. The diamond's social capital in those weeks was so considerable that proximity to her conferred a small portion of it on anyone who could plausibly be observed in proximity to her. I want to spend a moment on this last point, because I think it captures something important about what was actually happening. Being a diamond, in the Regency sense, was not simply a matter of being more admired than other young women. It was a matter of becoming a kind of social phenomenon in your own right, a presence whose reflected light fell on those who could position themselves near it. The men who rode alongside your carriage, the women who were seen entering your drawing room, the patronesses who acknowledged your mother particularly warmly, were all in different ways drawing on the borrowed glow of your situation. You were that spring, a kind of unintentional public utility, a source of social value that other people could draw from simply by being recognized as connected to you. The exhaustion of being looked at, which we will come to in a moment, was compounded by the strange awareness that you were, in some way, being used. Not unkindly, not necessarily without genuine affection in many cases, but used, all the same. People wanted what you carried, and they came near you to get it. There was a particular kind of gentleman who specialized in this. He was usually older than the marriageable young men. He was usually unmarried himself, by choice or by circumstance, with no particular intention of changing that situation. He was usually well-connected, well-dressed, charming, observant, and entirely without scruple about the small social uses he made of the connections he cultivated. He would attach himself to a diamond not as a suitor, but as a kind of admiring older companion, the man who could be seen in your mother's drawing room, with the implication that he was an old family friend, who could be seen escorting you to the carriage at the end of a ball, with the implication that he was a kind of avuncular protector, who could refer, in conversations with other men at his club, to having had a charming half-hour with you the previous evening, with the implication that he was the kind of man diamonds talked to. He was harmless, on the whole. He did not press for anything beyond the social proximity he had achieved. But he was a small and characteristic figure of the diamond season, and your mother, who recognized him at once, was polite to him, without ever quite admitting him fully into the family's confidence. The men who paid serious court to a diamond came in a range of types, and your mother and the various relatives and family friends who had taken an interest in your situation were already, by the end of the 3rd week, beginning to sort them. There were the men of the very highest consequence, the heirs to dukedoms and marquesates, the young earls and the established earls' sons, whose attentions, if they came to anything, would represent the kind of brilliant marriage that a diamond was now expected to make. There were the men of the second tier, the younger sons of great families, the heirs of substantial but not titled estates, the men who would, in any normal season, have been eligible parties for any debutante in town, but who, in your particular case, were now being assessed against the higher possibilities and were, in some cases, finding themselves quietly downgraded. There were the men of the third tier, the soldiers home from the war on half pay, the diplomatic attaches, the rising men of business with old family connections, who in any other season might have been hopeful suitors, but who, in your situation, had to recognize that their suit was probably not going to succeed. And there were, around the edges, the men whose intentions were less clear, the men of doubtful reputation, the men with debts that exceeded their estates, the men whose interest in the diamond was an interest in her dowry rather than in her person, who paid their court anyway, on the small chance that they could conceal their situation long enough to secure her before the truth came out. This last category was the one your father and his man of business were watching most closely. A diamond was, by definition, a young woman whose father had a substantial enough fortune to support the kind of London season that produced a diamond. A young woman whose dowry, in consequence, was likely to be considerable. The fortune hunters of London, who were a real and recognised category of the city's masculine population, knew this and acted accordingly. The diamond was their prime target, because the dowry was largest, and the family's anxiety to marry her brilliantly might, in some cases, override the usual due diligence about the suitor. Your father had instructed his lawyers to look discreetly into the financial situation of every gentleman whose name had been mentioned in connection with you. The reports came back in confidential letters, sealed with wax, and read in his study with the door closed. Some of the names were cleared. Others were quietly noted as unsuitable. The information did not, in most cases, make its way to you directly. But your mother knew which gentlemen were, by tacit family agreement, no longer to be encouraged. When one such gentleman called in the drawing-room, she would receive him with cool courtesy, refrain from offering him refreshment beyond the minimum required, and find a way to draw the visit to a close after the shortest possible interval. The gentleman, who had perhaps been hopeful, would understand. The signals in this society were rarely entirely subtle to those who knew how to read them. In the evenings you went to balls. Several a week, the pace had, since the elevation, become considerably more demanding than it had been in the first fortnight of the season. You were now expected at certain events whose hosts wished to advertise their connection to you. You were now invited, almost as a matter of course, to events that earlier in the season would have been beyond your reach. Your dance card filled every evening before you had finished greeting the hostess. Gentlemen were writing their names down weeks in advance, sending notes asking that a particular dance at a particular forthcoming ball be reserved for them. The first two dances of the evening, the ones it would have been a matter of comment to leave open, were always promised by morning of the day in question. The supper dance, which was the dance immediately preceding the supper interval, and which carried the implication that the gentleman would hand the lady down to supper and sit beside her there, was the most contested item on the card, and the gentleman who secured the supper dance with you at any major ball was, for that evening at least, marked out as a man being seriously considered. Your mother, seated with the other matrons on the chairs around the edge of the ballroom, watched the supper dance assignments with an attention that was almost painful in its focus. The choice of who got the supper dance she had taught you to make with care was a small declaration that the entire room would notice and would discuss for days afterward. The dances themselves require their own moment. The Regency Ballroom had, by 1814, a fairly settled repertoire of dances that any debutante was expected to have mastered before her presentation. The country dance, in its various local and named versions, was the bread and butter of the evening, the dance that filled the long stretches between the more formal moments. Country dances were performed in long lines, with the couples moving up and down the line in a pattern of steps that varied by the particular dance, but that any well-trained young woman could pick up by watching the first repetition. The cotillion, more elaborate, more French, with its squares of 4 couples and its set figures, had been the high-status dance of the previous generation, but was beginning, by 1814, to be displaced by the quadrille, a similar but updated form that was rapidly becoming the new standard at the most fashionable events. The quadrille required a particular kind of technical competence that not all the matrons quite trusted in the younger generation, and it was therefore, for a diamond, a useful opportunity to demonstrate the kind of training that her education had been intended to produce. You danced quadrilles well. Your mother had made sure of it. The dancing master, who had come 3 afternoons a week to your country house for 2 years, had drilled you in the figures until they were, by the time you came to London, second nature, and then there was the waltz. The waltz, in 1814, was newly admissible. It had been creeping into private parties for several years, but it was at Almack's in the previous season, or perhaps the one before that the patronesses had finally agreed to permit it on the public floor of the assembly. The decision had not been universally welcomed. Older matrons, in particular, found the waltz alarming. It involved the gentleman placing his hand on the lady's waist. It involved direct face-to-face contact between the partners throughout the dance. It involved a continuous holding, rather than the periodic touching of hands that the country dances and the quadrilles permitted. It was, in the eyes of those who disapproved of it, a foreign continental import of dubious moral character, and its arrival at Almack's was, for the older generation, one of the small signs that the world was sliding into a coarser future. For a diamond, the waltz presented particular challenges and particular opportunities. To waltz at all in a public ballroom in 1814 still required a certain sanction. At Almack's, the patronesses had to approve a young woman's first waltz, and the gentleman with whom she first waltzed in their presence acquired, for the rest of the season, a small status as the man with whom her formal waltzing career had been inaugurated. The choice of partner for the first waltz at Almack's was therefore, like the supper dance, a public statement. Your mother, in consultation with her sister and with the patroness who was most disposed in your favour, had decided some weeks in advance who that first waltzing partner would be. The choice had been carefully made. The gentleman in question, a young viscount of impeccable family connections and rather mild personality, was not someone you were likely to marry, but he was someone whose endorsement of you, by waltzing with you at Almack, would do you no harm, and would close off any awkwardness about who had been first. You had waltzed with him on the appointed Wednesday. The patronesses had observed. The seal had been set. From that point onward, you could waltz at any private ball, with any gentleman who asked, and a number did. The intimacy of the waltz, even in its restrained Regency version, was something that the older matrons had not been wrong to find unsettling. Standing close to a gentleman, with his hand at your waist and his other hand holding yours, with your faces only inches apart, with the music going on for what seemed like rather longer than the country dance's brisk progress, produced a particular quality of social intimacy that the previous dances had carefully avoided. Conversations during a waltz were, by the nature of the position, more private than conversations during a country dance, where the partners separated and reformed and rejoined other figures every few moments. You could, while waltzing, say things to your partner that would not have been overheard. You could be silent in his company in a way that conveyed a different meaning than the silence between strangers. The waltz was, in this sense, the closest thing that a Regency ballroom permitted to a private conversation between an unmarried young woman and a young man. And the choice of waltzing partners therefore mattered to a degree that the modern reader has to make a small effort to understand. To waltz with a gentleman more than once at the same ball was already a thing being commented on. To waltz with the same gentleman at 2 consecutive balls was a thing being noted in the morning calls. The diamond, who was being watched continuously, had to manage her waltzing with a precision that other young women were not held to in quite the same way. Almack's itself, the assembly rooms in King Street, St. James's, was the central institution of the Diamond's evenings. Almack's was where the verdicts of the season were partly formed and largely confirmed. The patronesses who controlled access to the Wednesday assemblies were the most concentrated single group of social power in fashionable London, and their attitude to a particular diamond shaped, more than perhaps any other single factor, how the rest of society would treat her. There were 7 of them in 1814. They were, in alphabetical order of their husbands' titles or family names, Lady Castlereagh, Lady Cowper, Lady Jersey, Princess Esterhazy, Princess Leven, Lady Sefton, and Mrs. Drummond Burrell. Each of them deserves a brief moment of acquaintance, because they shaped the diamond season more than the diamond herself perhaps fully understood at the time. Lady Castlereagh, Amelia, was the wife of Robert Stewart, Lord Castlereagh, the Foreign Secretary, who in 1814 was the most consequential figure in British diplomacy in Europe. She was warm, slightly stout, generous-spirited, less inclined than some of her colleagues to the small cruelties of social judgment. The diamonds whose seasons coincided with Lady Castlereagh's particular favour tended to remember her with affection. She was, in many of the surviving accounts, the patroness whose kindness was most consistently extended to nervous young women on their first appearance at Almack's, and her smile across the room could rescue a faltering diamond from a moment of public uncertainty. Lady Cowper Emily was the daughter of Lord and Lady Melbourne and the sister of William Lamb, who would later become Prime Minister under Queen Victoria. She was clever, charming, beautiful in her own right, and had a particular talent for the social management of difficult situations. She was married, not very happily, to Lord Cowper, and was eventually to marry, much later in her life, Lord Palmerston. In 1814 she was 36 and at the height of her social powers. The diamonds she liked, she protected. The ones she did not like found their evenings considerably more difficult than they would otherwise have been. Lady Jersey, Sarah Sophia, was the wife of George Villiers, Earl of Jersey. She was the most talkative of the patronesses and was nicknamed, behind her back, Silence, on the principle that she was anything but. She was clever, brittle, demanding, and could be devastating in her judgments, though she was capable of considerable kindness when she chose to extend it. She had been a great beauty in her youth, and remained, in 1814, a striking woman whose presence in any room was a fact to be reckoned with. She had herself been a celebrated young woman in her own debutante season more than 2 decades earlier, and she retained a certain proprietary interest in the careers of the new diamonds, who were, in some sense, her successors. Princess Esterhazy, Maria Theresia, was the wife of Prince Paul Esterhazy, the Austrian ambassador to the court of St. James. She brought to the patroness role the cosmopolitan sensibility of the continental aristocracy, which by 1814 was again accessible to the British social world after the long disruption of the war. She was widely regarded as one of the more genial of the patronesses, though her standards remained exacting. Princess Leven, Dorothea, was the wife of the Russian ambassador, Count Christopher Leven. She was, by general consensus, the most intellectually formidable of the patronesses, a woman whose correspondence with Metternich would later become one of the most important historical sources for understanding the diplomatic life of post-Napoleonic Europe. She was tall, thin, clever, observant, and almost surgical in her social judgments. She had introduced the waltz to Almack's, or had at least been a leading advocate for its introduction. She was, for a diamond, the most useful patroness to have on one's side, and the most dangerous to have against one. Her favour was not easily won, but when it was extended with intelligence and consequence. Lady Sefton was the wife of the Earl of Sefton, a Whig peer of considerable wealth, and she presided over a household at Croxteth in Lancashire that was, in its way, one of the great country establishments of the era. In London she was a quietly effective presence on the Patroness Committee, less often quoted than Lady Jersey or Lady Cowper, but consulted by those in the know with respect. Mrs. Drummond Burrell, Clementina Sarah, was the daughter of Lord Perth, and would in time become Lady Willoughby de Eresby. In 1814 she was the youngest and the least senior of the patronesses, but she had a sharp eye and a sharper tongue, and her judgments, when she rendered them, tended to be remembered. These 7 women, between them, decided who came to Almack's. The vouchers, the small printed tickets that admitted a young lady to the Wednesday assemblies, were issued at their discretion. The vouchers had to be obtained in advance, and could be withheld for any reason, or for none. To be denied a voucher was a public humiliation that could damage a young woman's standing for the rest of the season. To be granted one was the basic price of admission into the society at all. For the Diamond, the Patroness's attitudes were known and managed with continuous attention. Your mother, in the first week of the season, had paid a careful round of calls on those of the patronesses with whom she had a previous acquaintance. She had introduced you. She had observed how each of them received you. She had reported back in the evenings to your father in a series of small after-dinner conversations whose content was not for the rest of the household to hear. The patronesses' verdicts had begun to form. By the 3rd week, when the elevation declared itself, all 7 of them had, in one way or another, signalled their approval. The signalling had been subtle. A particular nod across a ballroom, a quarter-hour of conversation in the supper-room that lasted slightly longer than civility required, a small reference, in one of the patroness's own afternoon calls, to having seen you at a particular event. These small signals, accumulated, were the permission slip that the rest of fashionable London needed to make the elevation official. With 7 such signals collected, by the end of May, your status was fixed. The atmosphere of Almack's itself, on a Wednesday evening, was one of the more peculiar experiences of the Regency social calendar. The rooms were not, by the standards of the great private houses, particularly grand. They were a set of large but unremarkable assembly rooms above a building in King Street. The food was, by general consensus, dreadful. Thin slices of bread and butter, stale cake, lemonade and orgeat to drink, no wine. The Duke of Wellington himself was, on at least one famous occasion, turned away at the door for arriving in trousers rather than the requisite knee breeches, and was sent home to change. The strict 11 o'clock entry rule meant that anyone, including dukes, who arrived at 5 past was simply not admitted. The whole institution functioned in a way that was already slightly ridiculous to its more sceptical observers, as a kind of social monastery whose rituals were enforced with a rigour that was disproportionate to the actual splendour of what was happening inside. And yet to be admitted was the foundation of one's social existence in fashionable London. You came on Wednesdays, you danced, you drank the bad lemonade, you ate the stale cake, you were observed by the patronesses. You went home at 1 or 2 in the morning. The whole evening, in retrospect, had no particular content beyond the fact of your having been there. For the Diamond, Almack's was simultaneously the easiest and the most demanding venue of her week. It was the easiest because by the 3rd week of the season she had become accustomed to it, and the rituals had become familiar, and the patronesses had declared themselves on her side. It was the most demanding because everyone in the room was watching her, more closely than at any of the larger and more crowded private balls, and any small error of judgment at Almack's was the kind of error that became, by the next morning, the subject of half the morning calls in the city. To be at Almack's as a Diamond was to be on display in the most concentrated possible setting, The patronesses moved among the guests. The eligible men presented themselves for dances. The rival debutantes watched from the edges of the room with the particular kind of attention that only direct rivalry produces. The matrons watched from the chairs. The old men leaned on their canes near the doorways and watched too. Everyone watched everyone, but everyone, you increasingly understood, watched you. The atmosphere of the larger private balls was different. The great houses of Mayfair, Devonshire House on Piccadilly, Holland House out at Kensington, Lansdowne House in Berkeley Square, the various ducal mansions that opened their doors for the season's most important events, hosted balls that were grander than Almack's in every external respect. The food was better. The wine was real wine. The orchestra was larger. The candles in the chandeliers were innumerable. 300 or 400 guests might be present in any given evening, and the dance floor was therefore considerably less intimate than the assembly rooms of King Street. For the Diamond, the larger private balls offered a slightly easier evening than Almack's, because the sheer number of people in the room meant that the watching was less continuously concentrated. There were corners. There were anterooms. There were small intervals in which one could briefly not be at the centre of attention. These small intervals were, by the middle of the season, things you treasured. The supper interval, at any of these balls, was the centrepiece of the evening's social architecture. Supper was served around midnight, in a separate room or a series of separate rooms, and the order in which the company moved from the ballroom to the supper room was a matter of careful choreography. The supper dance partner handed his lady down to supper. The seating arrangements at the supper tables were a matter of maternal supervision. Who sat next to whom at supper was a fact that entered the next morning's gossip almost as soon as it had been observed. The food at the great private balls was substantial. Cold meats, jellies, ices, fruit, cakes, pastries, all laid out on long tables under candelabra. The wine was good. There were occasional silences in the conversation, when the music from the ballroom reached the supper room and seemed, briefly, to make further conversation feel unnecessary. Now, around the edges of all of this, there was a particular masculine institution, whose existence I want to mention because it shaped the Diamond's experience in ways that deserve acknowledgement. The clubs of St. James's Street in the Regency era were the parallel to the drawing rooms of Mayfair, the male institutional spaces where the verdicts on the women of the season were formed and confirmed and circulated. White's on the eastern side of St. James's Street at numbers 37 and 38 was the most famous of these, and the bow window at the front of the club, which looked out onto the street, was the seat of one of the most influential informal courts in the city. From that bow window, in the early afternoons of the season, a small number of men sat and observed the passing traffic of carriages and pedestrians on St. James's Street and pronounced in tones of considerable authority on what they saw. The most famous of these men, in 1814, was George Brummel. Brummel, in his early 30s by then, was the established arbiter of male fashion, a personal friend of the Prince Regent, a wit of the most cutting variety, and a man whose verdict on a woman, delivered with the particular drawling brevity that was his trademark, could shape that woman's reputation for the remainder of the season. He had risen from a relatively modest background on the strength of his intelligence, his style, and his particular gift for a kind of detached, amused commentary on the world around him that the Regent had found irresistible in the years of their close friendship. By 1814, however, the friendship was beginning to fray. Brummel had, in 1813 or thereabouts, made a comment about the Regent in the Regent's hearing that the Regent had not chosen to forgive, the famous remark in which Brummel, encountering the Regent at a public event, had turned to a friend and asked, with elaborate casualness, who his fat friend was. The Regent had heard. The intimacy of the friendship had cooled. By 1816, Brummel would be in such severe financial difficulty, and so far out of the Regent's favour, that he would flee to France to escape his creditors, and would never return to England. He would die in poverty and increasing mental decline in Caen in 1840. But in the spring of 1814 he was still in London, still at his bow window, still exerting the considerable influence of his accumulated reputation, and his attitude to a diamond mattered. Around Brummel at the bow window were a small group of intimates and imitators. Lord Alvanley, who would later be famous for the wit of his deathbed remarks; Henry Pierpont, known as Pierre, a man whose laconic manner was modelled on Brummel's; Sir Henry Mildmay, the youngest of the set, and the one who would, in time, become a parliamentary figure of some note. These men between them formed a kind of unofficial tribunal whose proceedings were not transcribed, but whose verdicts were communicated within hours through the network of clubs and coffee houses and dinner parties to every drawing room in town. Depart St. James's Street in the afternoon, in your carriage, with the awareness that the bow window of White's was occupied and that your carriage was being observed from it. It was a particular small ordeal that the Diamond conducted with as much composure as she could manage. The remarks that emerged from the bow window did not always reach the Diamond's ears directly. Some of them did. The polite version of a particularly cutting observation might find its way back to your mother through a sympathetic friend by the end of the week. The implied verdict, by the time it reached you, would have been softened in the transmission. But the awareness that the verdicts were being made daily was a fact you carried with you whenever you passed that part of St. James's Street. Thus, below the level of the clubs there was another layer of public attention that the Diamond had to manage, and this layer was more public still. The print shops of London, the most famous of which was Hannah Humphrey's establishment in St. James's Street, displayed in their windows the satirical engravings that constituted, in that era, the equivalent of mass circulation, political and social commentary. The great caricaturists Gilray, who would die in 1815 but who had been declining mentally for some years and whose active career had effectively ended; Rowlandson, who continued to produce satirical work of considerable bite; Cruikshank, who was rising in his powers and would inherit the mantle of the elder generation, produced regular prints commenting on the public life of the city. The subjects were politicians, the royal family, the assorted scandals of the season, and, with surprising frequency, the social phenomena of fashionable London. The Diamond of any particular spring, in the rare years when one became a sufficient phenomenon to merit it, might find herself the subject of a print. The print would not, in the strictest sense, name her, but it would identify her clearly enough by reference to a known feature of her dress, or a recently reported incident at a ball, or the particular gentleman with whom she had been observed dancing, that anyone passing the print shop window would understand who was meant. The crowds that gathered at the windows of Hannah Humphrey's shop to look at the latest prints were, for that Diamond, a kind of public confirmation of her position that was not always entirely welcome. To be in the prints was to be famous in a way that was not quite the way that aristocratic society admitted to being famous. It was a slightly vulgar fame. It crossed the line between the private world of the drawing rooms and the public world of the streets. The shopkeepers in Bond Street might recognize you. The boy who held the horses in front of your house might tell his friends, in the public house in the evening, that he worked for the Diamonds family. The maid who sold you ribbons might mention your name to her sister. The whole of London, in some sense, knew who you were, in a way that only the upper layers of society had previously known. Some Diamonds, on hearing that they had been depicted, dispatched a brother or a footman to St. James's Street to obtain a copy of the print, in order to know before the next morning's calls began exactly what had been said about them. A few Diamonds, in earlier eras, had been so distressed by their depiction that they had retired from the season altogether for a week. But for most, the prints were one more dimension of the public position they now occupied, to be absorbed and managed, and eventually quietly added to the family's collection of memorabilia from that particular spring. There exists, in the print collections of various country houses today, a substantial body of these caricatures, kept by the families who recognized themselves in them, sometimes with a small note in the margin, in a feminine hand, identifying the figures depicted, sometimes without any identification at all, but folded carefully into a drawer where it would be found, generations later, by a great-great-grandchild who had never heard the story. The press, in the more conventional sense, also paid attention to the diamond. The Morning Post was the most important paper for fashionable intelligence, the daily column that recorded who had been at which event, who had been observed dancing with whom, what gowns had been worn, what conversations had been overheard. The columnist was anonymous, and like all such columnists in any era, drew his information from a network of informants whose identities were never disclosed. Footmen, ladies' maids, hairdressers, dressmakers, all could be sources of information. The columnist's job was to assemble the day's gleanings into a coherent narrative that would interest his readers without offending the people he was writing about. The diamond featured prominently in the Morning Post's columns of any given season, though, again, never by name. The young lady in white satin trimmed with silver, who was admired at Lady So-and-so's ball on Tuesday evening, was one of a small number of recurring references, identifiable only to those who had been there or who knew someone who had. Belle's Weekly Messenger covered similar ground in a more leisurely format. La Belle Assemblée, the fashion magazine of the era, published descriptions of the season's most admired gowns and occasional plates of fashion. The Ladies' Magazine carried serialized novels and discussions of accomplishments, and the small social topics that fashionable women were thought to find interesting. Across all these publications, the diamond was a recurring subject. She was a kind of unnamed character of the spring, whose movements and choices and sartorial decisions were the substance of considerable column inches. She was, in a sense the modern reader will recognize immediately, a celebrity. The era did not have the word, in the sense in which we use it. But the phenomenon was the same. I want to pause for a moment now, and step back from the day-to-day texture, and think about what the cumulative effect of all this was on the young woman at the centre of it. Because the cumulative effect, by the middle of the season, was something that the surface accounts do not entirely capture, and that I think deserves more attention than it has historically received. You had become, by mid-June, a person who could not walk into any room in fashionable London without a small ripple passing through it. You had become a person whose image, in some sense, existed independently of you, in the form of 1,000 pieces of gossip and speculation and reported observation, circulating through the network of houses and clubs and shops and morning calls. The image was not entirely you. It could not be. The image was a composite, assembled by hundreds of observers from fragments of your conduct, refracted through their own preconceptions and rivalries and hopes, transmitted through channels that altered the original signal at every relay point. You knew by this stage in the season that the image existed. You also knew that you could not entirely control it, and that the gap between the image and the actual person you knew yourself to be was widening, inch by inch, as the weeks progressed. This is, I think, one of the central experiences of being singled out in any era, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. The young woman who had walked down the staircase in her white gown 6 weeks ago was a particular person. She had a particular sense of humour, particular preferences in books, particular small private griefs, particular habits of mind that made her recognizable to herself and to the few people who really knew her. She had a particular fondness for the cat that lived in the kitchen of the country house. She had a particular dread of certain kinds of social situation that her gentler relatives had always made allowances for. She had a particular, slightly self-deprecating sense of how she looked when she laughed, which had survived all of her education in social comportment because the moments of real laughter in her life had been too small and private to attract the kind of correction that the larger expressions had received. She was, in short, a recognizable young woman with the small idiosyncrasies of an actual person, and the people who really knew her knew her in those terms. The diamond, who was now circulating through the upper rooms of London, was a public figure constructed out of selected and idealized fragments of that person, projected onto the larger screen of the season. The two were not quite the same. The original young woman was still in there, somewhere, riding home in the carriage at 3 a.m, sitting on the edge of her bed unable to sleep, writing the unguarded letters to her 1 or 2 friends in the country who could be trusted. But she had, for the duration of this season, become the support staff for the more visible figure who bore her name. She did the work of preparing for the ball. She got dressed. She put on the gloves and the slippers and the small piece of jewellery her grandmother had left her. And then she handed herself over to the diamond, and the diamond went down to the carriage and into the ballroom, and the original young woman, in some sense, watched from inside her own face as the diamond did her work. For some young women in this position, the gap between the two figures became eventually unmanageable. There are accounts in the diaries of the period of diamonds who, by midsummer, had begun to feel that they did not entirely recognize themselves in the descriptions that came back to them through the morning call network. The image had, by that point, taken on a life of its own. People were attributing to her remarks she had not made, opinions she did not hold, qualities she did not believe she possessed. She was being congratulated, by women she had never met, on her wit when she did not consider herself particularly witty. She was being praised for her dignity in situations that she had, in actuality, found mortifying and confusing. The diamond was increasingly a public character whose internal life was inaccessible even to the woman who was technically hosting it. There is something almost unbearably modern about this, when you consider it carefully. The experience of being known by a large number of people as a version of yourself that you do not entirely recognize, the exhaustion of managing the gap between the public image and the private experience, the slight sense of unreality that descends over time when the image becomes more solid in the minds of others than the actual person is. We tend to think of these as 21st century problems, the side effects of the new technologies of attention. They are not. They are, very precisely, what happened to the diamond of every season for the entire long Regency period and well before it. The structures have changed. The architecture of attention has changed. The experience of the woman at the centre of it has not, in its deepest features, changed at all. Now, I want to spend some time with the costs that all this attention exacted, because I think this is the most underrepresented part of the experience, and the part that anyone who has ever found themselves unexpectedly visible in any era will recognize. The first cost, and perhaps the deepest, was the loneliness. This is going to sound counterintuitive, given the volume of social interaction we have just described, but it is, on examination, not counterintuitive at all. You were surrounded, every hour of every day, by people who wanted to be near you, seen near you, who wanted something from you, however small or however well-meaning, and among that crowd, the number of people who simply wanted to spend time with you, who were not in some way calculating in their interest in you, who would have wanted your company equally if you had been the most ordinary young woman of the season rather than its diamond, was very, very small. Possibly your mother, possibly your maid, Sarah, who had known you since you were 12 and who could not, for reasons of her position, calculate against you. Possibly 1 or 2 of the friendships you had brought up from the country with you, friendships with girls who were also in town this season, but who were not in your social orbit and did not stand to lose or gain anything from your situation. That was, in many cases, the entire list. Everyone else, even the people who genuinely liked you, was operating, at some level, in relation to your changed status, and the relation was not always one you could be entirely comfortable inside. In particular, the friendships you had begun to form with other debutantes in the first weeks of the season, before the elevation, were in most cases suffering. The girls you had walked with in the park in April, when you had all been simply candidates together in a roughly equal way, had had to adjust to the new situation almost overnight. Some of them had managed it gracefully, others had not. There were certain girls who by the third week had stopped seeking you out at balls, who had begun to find reasons not to walk with you in the park, who had become, in their politeness, slightly cooler than they had been. You did not blame them. You understood, more or less, what had happened. The mothers of these girls had, in some cases, suggested to their daughters that close association with a diamond was not necessarily in their daughter's interest. That being seen as part of the diamond circle was a way of being placed permanently in the diamond shadow, that their daughters would be better served by establishing their own quieter prospects rather than orbiting yours. The mothers were not wrong, but the result, on the level of the friendships themselves, was a slow, quiet diminishment of the warmth that had, just weeks earlier, been beginning to grow. There were exceptions. There were girls, secure in themselves or simply generous-spirited in a way that the situation could not undermine, who continued to walk with you, to laugh with you, to tell you frankly what they thought about the various gentlemen who had been paying you court, to send you the kind of unguarded notes that real friends send each other. These friendships, the few of them that survived the elevation, became in the course of the season more important to you than you would have expected, because they were the only relationships you had in which you could afford to be tired, in which you could afford, briefly, to stop performing. With everyone else, the performance had to continue. Even with your mother, in some sense you had to maintain a certain level of composure, because your mother was now under such pressure herself, was so deeply invested in the outcome, that to break down in front of her would have created a crisis you did not have the energy to manage. The friend who could let you simply collapse onto her bed for half an hour and complain about the previous evening without judgment was in that season more valuable than rubies. There were not many of these friends, but the ones there were, you would remember, decades later, with a clarity that would survive the fading of almost every other detail. One of these was your cousin Caroline, who had come up to town with her own family to be presented herself, and whose first season this also was, but who, being a quieter young woman with less striking looks and less of whatever the indefinable quality was that made a diamond, was occupying the more usual debutante position. Caroline had, in the early weeks of the season, been your ally. She had remained your ally through the elevation. She did not seem to mind, or mind enough to let it affect their friendship, that you had become the centre of attention while she had not. She was, you sometimes suspected, secretly relieved not to be the diamond. She had said as much to you once, over a quiet half-hour in your bedroom in the late afternoon, with the curtains half drawn and the dressing not yet begun. "I should hate it," she had said, the looking. "I do not know how you stand it." You had not had a good answer at the time. You did not have a good answer now. You did not stand it exactly. You endured it. The two were not quite the same, and Caroline, more than anyone else, seemed to understand the difference. The other was your school friend Elizabeth, who had not come up to town that season because her family could not afford the full establishment, but who had been at school with you in Bath for 2 years, and with whom you maintained the kind of correspondence that schoolgirl friendships sometimes produce. Elizabeth had been at home in Devonshire that spring, helping her mother nurse her younger brothers through an outbreak of measles, and her letters arrived regularly through the post, twice a week, and were the most important reading you did in those months. Elizabeth knew nothing about Almack's. She knew nothing about the patronesses or the fortune hunters or the bow window of White's. She knew you, in the way that schoolgirl friends know each other, at the level of small private jokes and shared memories of particular teachers and the nicknames you had given to the cat that lived on the kitchen wall. To write to Elizabeth was to remember, briefly, who you had been before all this began. The letters you wrote to her in those months were, in retrospect, the most honest writing you did in the entire season. You told her about the gowns. You told her, occasionally, that you wanted to come home. You did not, of course, mean it literally. But the wanting was real, in a way you could not say out loud to anyone in London, and the saying of it to Elizabeth, sealed up in a letter and given to the footman to take to the post, was, in those weeks, one of the few small reliefs you had access to. The second cost was the exhaustion of perpetual self-presentation. This is something the historical record does, when you read it carefully, document. The diaries and letters of young women who were in this kind of position, by their own accounts, describe a particular kind of fatigue that was different from ordinary tiredness. It was the fatigue of never, in waking hours, being able to relax the muscles of the face that held the public expression in place. The fatigue of always having to consider what could be said and what could not. The fatigue of being constantly watchful for the small social misstep that a less observed young woman could have made without consequence, but that you, because every detail of your conduct was now part of the record, could not. By the fourth week of being a diamond, most young women in this situation reported a kind of permanent low-grade headache, a feeling of being slightly behind their own face, a sense that the person who walked into ballrooms each evening was a carefully managed version of themselves, rather than themselves directly. Some diamonds developed, in this period, what their mothers called nerves, and what we might now describe as something closer to a sustained anxiety response. The fainting fits, the sudden tears in private, the difficulty sleeping despite the bone-deep tiredness, the loss of appetite, the small obsessive worries about what so-and-so had said at last night's ball and what it might have meant, were all documented in the correspondence of the era. The mothers, on the whole, were sympathetic. They had, after all, been through seasons of their own, even if not at this level of intensity, and they recognized the symptoms. The doctor was called more often than he might otherwise have been. Mild restoratives were administered. A morning or two of staying in bed and not receiving visitors was occasionally permitted, though only when absolutely necessary, because absence from circulation, even brief absence, was risky. There were always fresh young women coming out, always new candidates for the next week's whispered conversations, and a diamond who was not in her place at the next ball, the next park drive, the next morning call, was a diamond however slightly, to slip. The medical care available was, by modern standards, primitive. The family physician would prescribe a tonic, perhaps a small amount of laudanum to help with sleep, perhaps a restorative wine to be taken before dinner. The treatments were palliative rather than diagnostic. The actual underlying causes of the symptoms, the chronic sleep deprivation, the chronic stress, the inadequate nutrition during the season's most demanding stretches, were not understood as causes in the medical vocabulary of the era. The young woman was simply suffering from nerves, and the nerves were treated with the limited tools available, and the season continued. In the worst cases, a more serious withdrawal was permitted, a trip to Bath for the waters, a fortnight at the family seat in the country, a visit to relatives in Tunbridge Wells. These interventions were rare, because they were interpreted by the watching society as evidence that the young woman could not manage her position, and the verdict was difficult to recover from. But they were available in extremis, and few diamonds in any given decade availed themselves of them. There was a third cost, less often discussed, that was specific to the diamond in a way the first two were not. This was the cost of the rivalries, both among your fellow debutantes and among their mothers, that your elevation had activated. In a normal season, with no clear diamond, the various debutantes and their families operated in a kind of distributed competition that did not produce sharp focal points of rivalry. There were generic rivals, of course. A girl whose looks were similar to yours might be in competition for the attention of similar gentlemen. A family whose social standing was similar to yours might be in competition for the same invitations. But the competition was diffuse. With a clear diamond present, the rivalries focused. The girls who might, in another year, have been the diamond themselves were now defined for that season by the fact that they were not. Their mothers, who had perhaps invested years of preparation in the daughters' seasons, were now watching the Diamonds family with a specific and not entirely friendly attention. Their gowns were studied with reference to yours. Their dance cards were assessed against yours. Their successes were measured against your greater successes, and the assessments were not, in most cases, generous. You learned to recognize the particular look that a rival debutante's mother might give you across a ballroom. It was a look that was not openly hostile, because openly hostile was not within the social vocabulary of the era. It was rather a look of careful observation, of registration, of small ongoing accumulation of evidence. The rival mother was, in her own way, building a private brief against you, and the brief would be deployed in the conversations of the following weeks in ways calculated to cause the small kinds of damage that did not require a direct attack. A casual comment in the right ear about the precise shade of your gown being not quite right for your complexion, a reference to the fortune your father was spending and how impressive it must be that he could continue to do so, a small expressed sympathy for the strain you must be under. These were the weapons of the rival mother, and they were used with skill. Among the debutantes themselves, the rivalries took different forms. There were the girls who actively avoided you, in the way I have already described. There were the girls who attached themselves to you in the hope of benefiting from the proximity. There were the girls who maintained a cool civility that gave nothing either way. And there was occasionally a girl who attempted something more direct, a particular debutante, the daughter of an old family that had perhaps expected its own daughter to be the diamond of 1814, and had not been pleased to find that the position had been taken, made several small efforts in the course of the season to undermine your standing. Nothing that could be called open attack. A whispered remark to a particular gentleman about a story she had heard concerning your family. A claim in the right drawing room that she had reason to believe a particular suitor's interest in you was waning. A pointed exclusion of your mother from a small private gathering at her own family's house. These efforts were, on the whole, ineffective. The patronesses had decided in your favour, and a single rival debutante's manoeuvres were not enough to overturn that judgment. But the manoeuvres were registered. You knew about them. Your mother knew about them, and the small additional weight of having to manage them, in addition to everything else, was one more piece of the cumulative burden. I want to mention, before we move on, the figure who deserves more attention in any account of the Diamond season than the historical narratives usually give her, which is the Diamond's mother. Your mother had, as I mentioned earlier, been thrown into a position she had not expected to occupy. She had become, overnight, the manager of a campaign whose stakes were considerably higher than anything she had previously been responsible for. The strategic decisions that had to be made daily, who to receive and how warmly, which invitations to accept and which to politely decline, which rival mothers to court and which to outflank, which suitors to encourage and which to gently discourage, were her decisions, made on the basis of her own judgment, with consequences she would have to live with. Her husband was nominally consulted. Her sister-in-law and various cousins offered advice from their own past seasons, but the daily operational management was hers, and the responsibility was, in a way that none of the surface accounts captures, considerable. She was tired too. She had her own version of the perpetual self-presentation that you were experiencing. She had to be, at all times, the kind of mother whose daughter could be a diamond. She had to be elegant, gracious, slightly amused but not condescending, knowing but not pushy, present at the right events and absent from the wrong ones. She had to manage her own friendships with the matrons of the era, some of whom were genuinely warm and watching her own conduct as closely as the matrons watched yours. She had to write letters, conduct interviews, calculate the household budget against the rapidly mounting expenses, supervise the staff who were bearing the brunt of the additional work, attend the events at which her presence was required, and a babal be unfailingly available to you in the small private moments when you needed her counsel or her reassurance. It was, by any reasonable assessment, a heavier load than her body or her temperament had been designed to bear. She bore it because it was hers to bear, and because a daughter who had become a diamond was a daughter whose mother could not, for one season, falter. In the small, unwatched moments of her own day, she occasionally allowed herself to notice the cost. There was a particular afternoon in the 3rd week of June when the visitors had finished and the carriage had not yet been ordered for the park, when you found her in the morning room, alone, with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes resting on the small portrait of her own mother that hung above the fireplace. She was not weeping. She was not, on the surface, in any visible distress. She was simply sitting, very still, in the way that people sit when they are gathering themselves before the next engagement of a long campaign. You came in. She looked up. She smiled at you, in a way that was warmer than any smile she had managed in front of company that week. She said, "Well, my dear, are we ready for the park?" And you said, "Yes, Mama." And the moment passed, and the carriage was ordered, and the day continued. But you had, briefly, seen her without the public face. And the seeing of her was, in retrospect, one of the small things that bound you to her in a way that the formal mother-daughter relationship of the era did not always permit. You loved her. She loved you. The season required that the love be expressed largely through the management of practicalities. But it was all the same real, and you would, in the years to come, look back at her conduct of that season with a respect that would deepen over time. The Allied sovereigns arrived in London on the 7th of June, and for the next 3 weeks the city was given over to a sequence of public and private celebrations whose intensity exceeded anything in the recent memory of the capital. The Tsar of Russia, Alexander I, took up residence at the Pulteney Hotel in Piccadilly. His sister, the Grand Duchess Catherine of Oldenburg, who had already been in town for some weeks, and whose conduct had already produced considerable comment, was nearby. The King of Prussia, Frederick William III, with his sons, was lodged at Clarence House. Field Marshal Blücher, the old Prussian cavalry commander whose name had become a household word during the long final phase of the war, was lodged with the Prince Regent at Carlton House. Metternich was present. The combined diplomatic establishment of victorious Europe was suddenly, and for a brief few weeks, all in London at once. For the Diamond, the Allied sovereign's visit was a particular kind of test. The events held in their honour were the most heavily attended of the entire season, and they were the events at which fashionable London most wanted to be seen by the visiting royalty. To be at these events, and to be seen at them in the right way, was the highest level of social participation that the year had to offer. The Diamond, by the established convention, was expected to be there. Her mother had received the invitations. Her gowns for these particular occasions had been planned weeks in advance. The first of the great events was the state ball at Carlton House, given by the Prince Regent in honour of the visiting sovereigns. Carlton House, at the bottom of Lower Regent Street, was the Regent's London residence, and was being prepared for the event with the kind of extravagance that only the Regent could authorise. The ballroom was hung with new draperies. The orchestra was the largest that had been assembled in London that year. The supper was prepared by the Regent's own chefs, and was reputed in advance to be the most elaborate produced in living memory. The guest list was tightly controlled. To have been invited was, in itself, an event of consequence. You were invited. Your gown for the occasion had been made by Madame Lanchester in Bond Street, and was, as the dressmaker had taken some pleasure in noting during the fitting, the most expensive article she had constructed that year. White satin, with silver embroidery in a pattern of small leaves running around the hem, with a bodice trimmed with the kind of fine lace that had only just become available again, now that the war with France was over. The plumes for your hair were 3, exactly the height the occasion required. The pearl drop at your throat was the same one you had worn every important event of the season. a small private continuity that nobody but you and Sarah was likely to register. The carriage ride to Carlton House was longer than usual because of the crowds in the streets. People had gathered, as they did at every event of the Allied sovereign's visit, simply to see the carriages of the great arrive. You sat with your mother in the carriage, looking out at the upturned faces, conscious in a way you had not been before of being part of a public spectacle that extended beyond the rooms of the great houses. The crowd was good-tempered. The footman kept the way clear. The carriage moved slowly up to the courtyard of Carlton House. The interior of Carlton House on that evening was, by every account, dazzling. The candles were innumerable. The gilding of the rooms caught the candlelight and threw it back in a way that made the whole architecture seem to be in motion. The orchestra was already playing as you arrived. The Tsar of Russia was somewhere in the rooms with his sister, but you did not, on first entering, see him. The regent received the company in the long gallery, and you and your mother passed through the receiving line in the proper order, and your mother spoke a few words to the regent that he received with the particular kind of charming inattention that was his signature, and the introductions were made, and you were briefly presented to the King of Prussia, whose response was a stiff but courteous bow, and then to the Tsar himself, who looked at you for slightly longer than the formal etiquette of the moment required, and who said something complimentary in French that you would later not be able to remember exactly, but that had been audible enough that your mother recorded it in her small notebook the following morning. The Tsar's attention was, by the standards of his behaviour throughout the visit, conventional. He was known to favour particular ladies with particular attention, and one of his favourite English partners that summer was Lady Castlereagh's sister, with whom he had reportedly danced more than was strictly proper. You were not such a favourite, but the moment of his having looked at you for slightly longer than required was reported, in the gossip of the next day, as having occurred, and added to the small running tally of consequences that the season was continuing to produce. The dancing began. You danced the first dance with a young marquess whose name had been on your card for 3 weeks. You danced the second with a colonel of the guards whose conduct in the peninsula had earned him the regent's particular regard. You danced a third dance with a young attaché from the Russian embassy, whose presence on your card was a small concession to the international flavour of the evening, and who spoke charming French but rather worse English. You ate supper with a viscount whose family connections were of the very first water, and whose attentions to you that evening were, by the assessment of your mother and her sister, and the various interested observers around the supper room, the most serious of any of the gentlemen who had paid you court that season. Whether his attentions would turn into an offer, only the next several weeks would tell. But the supper at Carlton House, with him, in those rooms, on that night, was the kind of moment your mother had spent the entire season working toward. You went home at 4 in the morning. The streets of Mayfair were already showing the first grey of dawn by the time the carriage reached your door. The city had not, on this particular night, gone to bed. There were carriages everywhere, taking other guests home, and groups of revellers still on foot in St. James's Square, and the watchman calling the hour, and the milk carts beginning their early rounds. The whole city had been awake for the regent's ball. The Diamond, in her white satin and her silver embroidery, had been at the centre of it. You went upstairs with Sarah behind you, and the dressing was undone, and you were in your nightgown by 4:15, and you slept until past noon. The events of the Allied sovereign's visit continued for another fortnight. There was the public review at Hyde Park, attended by a crowd estimated at over 100,000. There was the Guildhall banquet given by the City of London. There was the great fête at Burlington House, where the Prince Regent's cousin presented an entertainment whose details were the subject of newspaper coverage for days afterward. There was the ball at White's, given by the members of the club in honour of the visitors, where the Tsar danced and the Regent presided, and the Duke of Wellington, who had returned from his diplomatic posting in Paris. was the center of his own particular attention. You were at most of these events. By the end of the visit, you had been seen by every member of the visiting royalty at least once, by the most important of them several times, by the Tsar's sister with what your mother thought might have been a small particular interest. The diamond's profile in 1814 was not a private profile. By midsummer, your name or the description of you that stood in for your name had circulated through every drawing room in fashionable London at least 3 times, and through several of the salons of the visiting continental aristocracy at least once. The Allied sovereigns left in late June. The pace of the season slowed, slightly, in their absence. There remained the continuing schedule of balls, breakfasts, morning calls, and park drives, but the great compressed intensity of the previous 3 weeks lifted, and you and your mother had, briefly, the leisure to take stock of where things stood. The supper at Carlton House had crystallized in the assessment of the family the most likely shape of the resolution of the season. The Viscount, whose name was now being used in your mother's correspondence with her sister with a particular kind of care, was clearly the leading candidate. He had not yet declared himself formally. He was, by all accounts, considering. His own family's position was being communicated through intermediaries. His mother had paid a second call on yours in the last week of June. The signals were all good. It was at this point in the season, with the resolution of the central question apparently approaching, that the first real proposal of marriage from a different gentleman arrived. The gentleman in question was not the Viscount. He was an earl of somewhat older establishment, a man in his early 30s who had been paying you court with a certain quiet intensity since the second week of the season, and whose interest, while never doubted, had been assumed by the family to be unlikely to convert into a formal offer, because the Earl himself was thought to be more interested in observation than in commitment. He had surprised everyone by writing, on a Tuesday morning in early July, to your father, requesting the opportunity to call on him in his study at his earliest convenience. The letter arrived at breakfast. Your father read it. He passed it to your mother. Your mother read it. She passed it back to your father. They looked at each other across the breakfast table with the kind of expression that married people exchange when something has happened that they need to discuss, but cannot, in front of their daughter, entirely discuss. Your father said, "Well, it would seem," and your mother said, "Yes, indeed." You did not, at that breakfast, know what the letter contained. You found out later in the morning, through your mother, in the morning room with the door closed. The procedure when an offer of marriage was made by a gentleman to a young woman was always conducted formally between the gentleman and the young woman's father in the first instance. The young woman herself was not present in the initial conversation. The gentleman would arrive at the house at the appointed hour. He would be received by the father in his study. He would state his intentions. He would describe his financial situation in considerable detail, including his estate, his income, his prospects, and the provision he was prepared to make for his future wife in the event of various contingencies. He would request the father's permission to address the young woman directly. The father, depending on his own assessment of the suit, and on his prior consultation with his wife and with his daughter, would either grant or withhold that permission. If it was granted, the young woman would be summoned, and the gentleman would, in the appropriate moment, make his offer. The young woman would then either accept or decline. If she accepted, the formal process of negotiating the marriage settlement between the lawyers of the two families would begin. If she declined, the matter would be considered closed, and the gentleman would withdraw with whatever grace he could manage. In your case, the procedure was followed with one small variation, which was that your father, before granting the gentleman permission to address you, summoned you to the morning room and asked you directly what you wished to say to the gentleman if he were permitted to speak to you. This was not the procedure of every household. Some fathers in 1814 would simply have made the decision themselves and presented their daughters with the result. Your father, who was a kinder man than most, and who had watched you closely throughout the season, wanted to know what you thought before he gave his answer. You told him what you thought, which was that you respected the Earl, that you appreciated the seriousness with which he had paid you court, but that you were not in a position, at present, to accept his offer. You said this with as much composure as you could manage, and your father heard you out, and at the end of your small speech, he nodded once, slowly, and said, "Very well, my dear." And you left the morning room and went upstairs to your own bedroom, and sat on the edge of your bed for a quarter of an hour, looking at the wall, thinking about what had just happened. Your father returned to his study. The Earl was admitted shortly afterward. The conversation was, by all accounts, conducted with considerable courtesy on both sides. Your father told the Earl that he was sensible of the great honour the Earl had paid the family by his suit. He told him that, after consulting with his daughter, he had to convey to him that her present feelings were not such as would permit her to receive his proposal favourably. He told him that the family would of course continue to value his acquaintance. The Earl received this with the kind of grace that his upbringing had prepared him for. He bowed. He thanked your father for his time. He left the house, walked down the steps to his carriage, was driven away, and did not, in the rest of the season, attempt the suit again. He would in time marry someone else, a young woman of less elevated profile, but of warm and sympathetic temperament, and would, by all accounts, be very happy with her. You would meet her, years later, at a country house party, and would think well of her. The Viscount, meanwhile, continued his deliberations. Whatever was happening in his own family's discussions of the matter, it was apparently happening slowly. The expected formal offer did not come in the first week of July. It did not come in the second. By the third week of July, with the season's end approaching and the great houses beginning to close, the offer had still not arrived, and your mother, in her private correspondence with her sister, was beginning to express the particular kind of anxiety that the situation produced. Was the Viscount going to declare himself? Had he changed his mind? Had something been said in his own family circle that was making him hesitate? The intermediaries, when consulted, reported that nothing was wrong. The Viscount was simply a young man who took his decisions slowly. He would, his uncle assured your father at his club, come to the right conclusion in time. But the time was running short, and the closing of London for the summer was a kind of natural deadline beyond which the situation became more complicated. The offer, when it came, arrived on the afternoon of the 24th of July. The Viscount called at 4 o'clock. The procedure was followed. Your father received him in his study. The conversation took longer than the Earl's had, and was conducted with a different, warmer texture, because the Viscount was a young man your father had genuinely come to like. The terms he proposed were generous. The settlement he was prepared to make on you in the event of his death was substantial. The provision for any children was carefully considered. Your father, having heard him out, gave his permission for the Viscount to address you directly, and you were summoned, and you came down, and you sat in the morning room with him, and he made his proposal in the formal language that the moment required, and you accepted it. The acceptance was not, in fact, the outpouring of romantic emotion that the novels of the era and the fiction of subsequent generations have led us to expect. You said yes. He said thank you. He took your hand. He held it for a longer moment than was strictly necessary. There was a quality of mutual relief in the room that was almost more powerful than any other emotion. The thing had been done. The season had produced its result. The Viscount could go back to his uncle and report that the matter was concluded. You could go back to your mother and report that the offer had been made and accepted. The whole anxious choreography of the previous weeks had reached its ending, and the ending was the ending you had hoped for, and there was, in that fact, a kind of quiet satisfaction that lay somewhere between joy and exhaustion. Romantic love, in its fuller form, would, you both suspected, develop in the years of the marriage. For now what you had was respect, mutual liking, the rational confidence that you would be able to make a life together, and the particular pleasure of having brought the long ordeal of the season to its appropriate conclusion. It was, by the standards of the era, a very good outcome. The Viscount left the house at 5:30. Your mother, when she came into the morning room afterward, found you sitting by the window, looking out at the late afternoon light, with an expression on your face that she did not, at first, recognize. It was the expression of a young woman who had, after months of effort, finally been allowed to stop performing. The engagement was announced in the Morning Post the following morning. The visit cards from the women of London began arriving by the afternoon. The whole apparatus of social acknowledgement that had been operating around you for the previous 2 months now turned, with the same efficiency, to acknowledging the engagement. The patronesses called, the matrons called, the rival mothers called, with smiles that were slightly more genuine than their previous smiles, because the rivalry was now formally over and the question of the Diamond's marriage had been answered. Some of the rival mothers, indeed, were now turning their attention to the next year's season and potential Diamond, who was almost certainly one of their own daughters, and who would now have a clear field. The friend who had been your closest ally throughout the season, your cousin Caroline, came round in the late afternoon, and the two of you went up to your bedroom together and sat on the bed and laughed properly, in a way you had not laughed in weeks. Now, before we close, I want to spend some time with the historical context that all of this takes place inside, because I think it adds to the picture of what the Diamond's experience meant in its own era. The phenomenon we have been describing did not begin in 1814 or in the Regency. It had a longer history, and the history is worth knowing because it shaped the expectations that surrounded any particular Diamond season. The most famous antecedents of the Regency Diamond, the women whose stories were the founding myth of the entire phenomenon, were the Gunning sisters. They were not Regency women. They came up to London in 1751, 63 years before the spring we have been describing. They were the daughters of an impoverished Anglo-Irish family of no particular distinction. Their father, John Gunning of Castle Coote in County Roscommon, had married a woman of slightly better family than his own, a Bourke, but neither of them brought to the marriage the kind of fortune that would have allowed their daughters to make brilliant matches in the conventional way. Maria Gunning was born around 1732. Elizabeth Gunning was born around 1733. The two sisters grew up in genteel poverty in Ireland, with the kind of education that could be afforded to daughters of a family in their situation, which was considerably less than would have been provided to the daughters of a wealthy English gentleman of equivalent rank. They were not, by any conventional standards, prepared for the careers they were about to have. They had, however, faces. Both sisters were spectacularly beautiful, in a way that was unusual enough that even contemporary accounts, which tended to use the language of beauty rather promiscuously, agreed on the point. Their mother, who understood what she had been given, took them to London in 1751 to make whatever they could of it. The family had no establishment in London, no connections to speak of, no introductions to the right hostesses, no tickets to the right rooms. They were, by the conventional rules of the marriage market, entirely without resources. What they had was the faces of the two daughters, and the mother's determination, and a small allowance from a sympathetic uncle, and that was all. What happened next was something close to a complete suspension of the conventional rules. Within weeks of the sisters' arrival in London, they had become a sensation of such proportions that crowds gathered in the streets to look at them. The phrase the Gunnings entered the language. People who could not afford the kind of social access that would have allowed them to attend the same events as the Gunnings travelled to particular parks and particular streets at particular hours, simply to see them pass. On one famous occasion in Hyde Park, the press of the crowd around their carriage was such that the police had to be called to manage it. The carriage could not move. The crowd, which had not come to demonstrate or to protest, but simply to look at two faces, had to be dispersed by force. The sisters, who were perhaps in their late teens or very early 20s at this point, had become a public phenomenon of a kind that London had not previously witnessed. The marriages followed. Elizabeth, the younger sister, married James Hamilton, the Duke of Hamilton, in February 1752. The wedding, which was conducted with a haste that was already a matter of comment, used a curtain ring borrowed from a bedstead because there had not been time to procure a proper wedding ring. Elizabeth thus became, at 19, the Duchess of Hamilton, the wife of one of the most senior peers of Scotland, the chatelaine of an estate of immense extent and considerable wealth. The Duke died in 1758, leaving her a young widow with several children. She married again the following year to John Campbell, who became, in due course, the Duke of Argyll. She was thus, in succession, Duchess of Hamilton and Duchess of Argyll. She was eventually created, in her own right, Baroness Hamilton of Hambledon, in 1776, by King George III. She was the mother of 4 dukes. She lived to be 56. She was, by any reasonable assessment, the most successful product of the diamond phenomenon in the entire century, and her trajectory was the one that subsequent diamonds and their mothers had as their unspoken aspiration. Maria, the elder sister, married George Coventry, the Earl of Coventry, also in 1752, a few weeks after her sister's marriage. The Earl was not in social rank the equal of the Duke of Hamilton, but he was a substantial peer of considerable estate, and the marriage was, by the standards of what the family had a right to expect, a very good one. Maria became Countess of Coventry. She was famous, in her short adult life, as a beauty, as a celebrity, and eventually as a tragedy. She used cosmetics heavily, in the style of fashionable women of her era. The cosmetics of the 18th century contained, in many cases, white lead, which was understood to whiten the complexion in the way that was fashionable, but was not, at the time, understood to be poisonous. Maria's cosmetic use was, by all accounts, particularly heavy. She also developed, in the late 1750s, what we would now probably call consumption, the slow wasting disease that took so many young people of her era. She died on the 30th of September 1760, at the age of 27. The contemporary explanation involved the cosmetics. Modern historians have suggested that consumption was probably the actual cause, with the cosmetics perhaps contributing to her decline. Whatever the medical truth, her death was a public event of considerable significance and was understood by the watching public as the dark counterpart to her sister's brilliant success. The 2 sisters had risen together. One had ascended into the comfortable longevity of a great matriarchy. The other had been used up and discarded by the fashionable life that had elevated her and had died young, beautiful, and exhausted. The Gunning story by 1814 had been part of London's social mythology for 2 generations. Your mother had been told it by her mother, who had been a young woman in the immediate aftermath of the Gunning seasons. The Gunning sisters were the ghosts behind every diamond season, the original example that had defined what was possible and what was at stake. Some diamonds, in their later lives, looked back at the Gunning trajectory with a kind of recognition. They had been through, in their own attenuated way, what the Gunnings had been through. Some had ended up as duchesses. Some had ended up worse than they had begun. Most had ended up somewhere in the middle, neither triumphant nor tragic, in marriages that worked out reasonably well over the long term, and that produced, by their later years, the slow, dignified life of the senior matron who could remember her own season as one of the more vivid passages of her younger life. There were other antecedents, less mythological than the Gunnings, who were more present in your mother's living memory. Lady Jersey herself, the patroness whose acquaintance had so much shaped your own season, had been a diamond in her own youth. Sarah Sophia Fane had come out a generation earlier and had been, that season, the most celebrated young woman of the year. Her marriage to Lord Villiers, who became the Earl of Jersey, had been considered a brilliant match. Her subsequent career as a patroness, 20 years later, had been built on the foundation of her own debutante celebrity. There was a certain quality of recognition between Lady Jersey and the new diamonds of any given season. She had, some matrons whispered, been kinder to certain diamonds than she had to others, and the kindness was sometimes attributed to her recognition of her own younger self in the new candidates. Whether this was true, or whether it was simply the kind of thing that observers said about figures whose conduct was always being interpreted, was one of the small, undecided questions that floated around her presence at Almack's. There had also been, more recently, the difficult case of Lady Caroline Lamb, who had been a celebrated young woman in the early years of the century, who had married William Lamb, the future Prime Minister, in 1805, and who had then, in 1812, conducted the affair with Lord Byron that had become one of the great public scandals of the era. Caroline Lamb was not, strictly speaking, a diamond in the technical sense. She had been a celebrated debutante, but the diamond designation, in its strictest application, required a particular concentration of attention that Caroline had not quite had. But her trajectory was, by 1814, a cautionary tale that every mother of a celebrated young woman knew. The young woman who had been highly visible in her debutante years could, in subsequent years, be highly visible in ways that were considerably less desirable. Marriage was not, it turned out, a final settlement that closed the question of public scrutiny. The marriages that followed, celebrated debuts, continued in some cases to be conducted in a kind of public eye that the women involved had not anticipated. Your mother, who knew the Caroline Lamb story in detail, had spoken to you at the start of the season with a certain seriousness about the importance of conducting yourself after marriage as well as before, with the kind of restraint that would prevent your name from appearing in connection with public scandal. The conversation had not been entirely comfortable, but the warning was real, and the example was current, and you had taken it on board with the seriousness that your mother's tone had required. There was, finally, the case of Princess Charlotte, the only legitimate child of the Prince Regent and the heir presumptive to the throne, whose own debutante experience was happening in parallel with yours. Charlotte, born in 1796, was 18 in the spring of 1814. She had been engaged, in late 1813, to William, Prince of Orange, the heir to the Dutch throne. She had broken that engagement off in June 1814, during the Allied sovereign's visit, in circumstances that were the subject of intense gossip and that involved her own preference for a different match and her father's furious response to her independence of judgment. She would, in 1816, marry Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg in a marriage that turned out briefly to be very happy. She would die in childbirth in November 1817 at the age of 21, in an event that plunged the country into a mourning that lasted for months and that had consequences for the British succession that ran for the rest of the century. Her story, in its happiness and its tragedy, was followed by the women of the season as a kind of magnified version of their own narratives. Charlotte was not, in any real sense, a private person, but her public ordeal, her engagements and her broken engagements and her marriage and her death, was watched by the debutantes of her era, and by you in particular, with the kind of attention that suggested they understood her experience as continuous with their own, however different the scale. What I want you to take from these stories as we begin to draw toward the end of our own is a sense of how complicated the diamond situation really was. She was admired, yes, and the admiration was real, and there were certainly moments in any diamond season when she felt the pleasure of being celebrated in the way that anyone feels pleasure at being valued. But the admiration was attached to expectations. The expectations were enormous. The channels through which she had to navigate them were narrow, the timeline on which the navigation had to be completed was short, and the cost of failure was a kind of permanent quiet diminishment that she would carry for the rest of her life. The diamond season was a 4-month-long final examination conducted in public with the answer required to be a marriage proposal of a very specific kind, and with no possibility of retaking the test the following year on the same terms. The diamonds who came through this with their happiness intact, who married well in the social sense, and also married kindly in the human sense, who found themselves at 35 in a marriage that had grown into companionship and a household that was a real home, were the lucky ones. They existed. The historical record contains many of them. The marriage of a Regency diamond was not statistically more likely to be unhappy than the marriage of any other young woman of her class, but the diamond's marriage was watched in a way that other marriages were not. Her happiness or her unhappiness was a public question. The verdict on her season would not really be settled until her marriage had been observed for a few years, until the children had begun to arrive, until the husband had revealed himself as the man he was actually going to be rather than the man he had appeared to be in his courting. Only then would the final assessment of her elevation be made. And the assessment would not be made by her, but by the same drawing rooms that had elevated her in the first place. Before I bring us to the closing of the season, I want to spend some time with the textures of the spring that have not yet been described, because the diamond season was not made up only of the great state events and the weighty calculations of marriage. It was also made up of the smaller pleasures and the quieter rituals that filled the long stretches between the moments that mattered most. These smaller textures were, in their way, the part of the season that the women who lived through it remembered most fondly in their old age. The state ball at Carlton House was a memory you would carry forever, but it was a memory of public spectacle. The afternoon at Vauxhall Gardens, with the lanterns coming on as the dusk fell over the river, was a memory of a different kind, more intimate, more private, more like the kind of memory that one returns to alone in the small hours of a winter morning 30 years later. Let me start with the royal drawing room, because it was the formal beginning of your social existence, and I have not yet given it the attention it deserves. The drawing rooms were the formal court receptions held by Queen Charlotte at St. James's Palace, at which young women of suitable rank were presented to the Queen as a kind of official entry into the world of society. The Queen, by 1814, was an old woman in poor health, and the drawing rooms were less frequent than they had been in earlier decades, but they remained the most important formal occasion of any debutante's season. To be presented at court was to have been formally recognised as a member of the world that mattered. To not be presented was to be, however celebrated in private circles, a young woman of slightly ambiguous standing, but you had been presented at the drawing room held in early May. The dress code for a court presentation was, by the standards of 1814, archaic to the point of absurdity. The fashionable gowns of the period were the high-waisted, slim-skirted, classical-influenced dresses that had been the standard for a decade. But the dress code at court still required the hoop skirt, that wide-spreading petticoat structure that had been the height of fashion in the middle of the previous century, and had been preserved in court etiquette long after it had been abandoned everywhere else. The result was a costume that combined the high-waisted, fashionable bodice with a hoop skirt that stuck out at the hips in a way that no woman of taste would have worn in any other context. The effect was, by every contemporary account, unflattering. The combination did not work. The proportions were wrong, but the dress code was the dress code, and a young woman attending a drawing room had to wear what the Queen's establishment required. The plumes were also obligatory. 3 ostrich plumes, set into the back of the head in an arrangement that had not been seen at any private ball in years. The plumes were tall, considerably taller than the plumes for an ordinary evening, because the height was prescribed and a sign of the formality of the occasion. The plumes had to remain upright through the long wait in the antechambers, the slow procession through the rooms, the brief moment of being presented to the Queen, the curtsy, the careful backing away that the protocol required, and the equally slow procession back out. The plumes did not always cooperate. There were stories told in the privacy of family circles afterward, of plumes that had drooped at the critical moment, been dislodged in the press of the crowded antechamber, of plumes that had had to be discreetly readjusted by a watchful sister or aunt before the young woman in question approached the throne. You had managed your plumes successfully. The whole presentation had taken about 4 hours from arrival to departure, and in that 4 hours you had been on your feet for almost the entire time, in the hoop skirt that was not designed for sitting comfortably, with plumes that required constant attention to maintain their position, in the press of perhaps 100 other young women in similar costumes, who were also waiting to be presented. The actual moment of presentation had lasted perhaps 30 seconds. You had been announced, you had advanced toward the throne, you had made the deep curtsy that the Queen's Chamberlain had instructed you to make, you had risen, you had received the small acknowledging nod that was all the Queen, in her exhausted old age, had energy to bestow. You had backed carefully away, watching the floor for any obstacle that might trip you in your retreat, and you had returned to the side of the room where the other young women who had been presented were now permitted to wait until the rest of the day's presentations had been completed. The whole ceremony, in its archaic dignity and its slight absurdity and its undeniable significance, had been the official beginning of your season. You had remembered it afterward, as one remembers a long and slightly tedious religious ritual that has, all the same, marked something important. You were now, formally, out. The pleasure gardens of London were a different kind of social institution from the great houses, and they offered the Diamond a different kind of experience. Vauxhall Gardens on the south bank of the Thames was the most famous of these. It had been operating, in various forms, for over a century by 1814, and was a strange hybrid institution that was neither quite a public park nor quite a private resort. You paid an entry fee 4 shillings and 6pence by 1814, and once inside you had access to the whole apparatus of the gardens, which included the long supper boxes around the central rotunda, the orchestra that played from a raised platform, the famous lighted walks that were illuminated by thousands of small oil lamps when the dusk fell, and the various entertainments that the proprietors arranged on different evenings, fireworks, balloon ascents, masquerades on the appointed nights, concerts, exhibitions of acrobatics or military displays. Vauxhall was, by 1814, slightly past its peak as a fashionable resort. It had been the most exclusive of the pleasure gardens in the middle of the previous century, but the spread of accessibility had brought a wider range of patrons into the gardens by the Regency, and the most discriminating members of fashionable society sometimes preferred Ranelagh, which had been more exclusive in its own time, or simply avoided the public gardens altogether in favour of private events. But Vauxhall was still attended by the fashionable, particularly on its grandest gala nights, and a Diamond was expected to make at least one appearance there in the course of her season, both because the gardens were one of the few places where fashionable London visibly intersected with the wider city, and because the lighted walks of Vauxhall in the evening were, by general consensus, one of the more beautiful sights that any London season had to offer. You went to Vauxhall in the second week of June with your mother, your father, your cousin Caroline, and a small party of family friends. You had taken a supper box for the evening, one of the boxes around the central area of the gardens where the orchestra played, and you had eaten the supper of cold meats and ham and the famously thinly sliced beef that the gardens were known for, with the small flagon of arrack punch that was the traditional Vauxhall drink. The ham had been thin, the arrack punch had been strong, and you had drunk only a very little of it on your mother's quiet instruction. Around 11, when the last of the daylight had drained out of the sky and the lamps along the walks had been lit, the company began to move out of the supper boxes into the gardens proper, and you and Caroline, with your mother and aunt at a careful distance behind you, walked slowly along the lighted walks among the other strollers, looking up at the small lamps in the trees, listening to the music drifting from the rotunda, observing the other parties of fashionable people who were doing the same thing, There was a particular quality to walking in Vauxhall on a summer evening that was unlike any other social experience available in London. The gardens were public, but the lighting was magical. The crowds were respectable, but not exclusively aristocratic. The conversations were less constrained than they would have been in a drawing room. You could, in Vauxhall, allow yourself a slightly looser quality of public manner than was permissible in any of the other settings of the season. You could laugh more freely. You could pause to look at a particular illuminated grouping of lamps for longer than the strict economy of social attention would have permitted in a Mayfair drawing room. You could, in the small alcoves and quieter walks, have brief conversations with the gentlemen who happened to be walking the gardens at the same time, in the kind of casual social exchange that the more formal venues did not encourage. Vauxhall was, in this sense, the closest thing the Regency season offered to a kind of informal social space, and the Diamond, like every other young woman of her position, found in it a small precious relief from the more rigorous protocols of the rest of her week. The literary scene of London in 1814 deserves a moment of attention also, because it was a part of the social world that the Diamond's family, depending on its inclinations, might or might not have been involved in, but that touched the social rooms of the season in ways that were impossible to entirely avoid. London in 1814 was a city in which the most famous English poet of the era was conducting a private life of such elaborate scandal that his name appeared in conversations across the city at any hour of the day. Lord Byron, whose Childe Harold's Pilgrimage had been published in 1812 and had made him, in his own famous phrase, awake one morning to find himself famous, was, by 1814, the most discussed literary figure in England. He was also, by 1814, in the early stages of the personal complications that would, by 1816, drive him out of England forever. He was being pursued still by Lady Caroline Lamb, whose obsession with him had not yet quite ended. He was being courted by his future wife, Annabella Milbank. He was the subject of constant gossip about the nature of his attachment to his half-sister, Augusta Lee. The whole apparatus of his personal scandal was, in the spring of 1814, gathering toward the public catastrophe that would unfold over the following 2 years. You had not, in the course of the season, met Byron directly. He attended the major balls when he chose to, and he avoided them when he did not, and the matrons of fashionable London, including the patronesses of Almack's, were divided about him in ways that made his appearances at any particular event uncertain. Lady Jersey was friendly with him. Lady Cowper had reservations. Princess Leven found him interesting. Lady Castlereagh was politely cool. Whether Byron would be at Lady So-and-so's ball on a particular evening was a question that animated the morning calls for hours, and the answer, when it came, was rarely predictable. You had, however, encountered him once, at a salon held by an older lady of literary inclinations, who was a distant cousin of your mother's, and who had insisted, in the 3rd week of June, that you and your mother attend her Tuesday afternoon gathering. The salon was held in a small but elegant drawing room in a house in Half Moon Street. The company was largely literary, with a sprinkling of the fashionable. Byron was there. You were introduced to him briefly, in the way that introductions were managed at such gatherings. He was perhaps 26, slightly lame from the foot deformity he had carried since childhood, dressed with a careful negligence that you understood, even at first sight, was the most carefully studied form of dress in the room. He looked at you for a moment with the kind of attention that he was, in those years, famous for being able to bring to bear on women he had just met. He said something polite. You said something polite back. The conversation moved on. He turned to speak to someone else. The whole encounter had lasted perhaps a minute, but you were aware, in the days afterward, that it had occurred, and that it would in some small way become part of the season's record. You had been introduced to Lord Byron at a literary salon. The fact would, within days, be known to your immediate circle. It would, within weeks, have circulated to the wider acquaintance who took an interest in such things. It would by some be retold with the suggestion that the encounter had been more significant than it had actually been. You, who had been present and knew exactly what had happened, would be unable, without the kind of direct contradiction that would itself produce comment, to clarify the record. Byron's celebrity in 1814 was such that even a brief exchange with him at a salon became, in the retelling, a small social fact whose dimensions could not be fully controlled by the people who had actually been present. This was, in its way, a particular instance of the general principle of the diamonds experience. The events you participated in were, in the very moment of their occurring, beginning to become stories about the events. The stories travelled through the network of London gossip with the same speed as the events themselves. By the time the carriage was returning you home from the salon in Half Moon Street, the story of your having met Byron there was already being told in another house by someone who had been in the room and was now visiting elsewhere, and the story was already, in small ways, being elaborated. The diamond, at 20, was learning what it was to be the kind of person whose life was lived simultaneously in the world of actual events, and in the parallel world of how those events were being narrated to other people who had not been present. The two worlds did not quite align. The gap between them was, in many cases, the difference between what the diamond herself would have said about her own day and what fashionable London thought it knew about her. Let me, before we move on, give you a particular evening in the middle of the season, an ordinary Wednesday at Almack's in mid-June, just to settle the rhythm of what a typical evening felt like, once the elevation had stabilized and the pace of the season had become something close to routine. You arrived at the rooms in King Street at 11:15. You and your mother had been admitted at the door, the patroness on duty, who was Lady Cowper that evening, having greeted you with the small particular nod that at that point in the season you had grown accustomed to receiving. The cloakroom had taken your shawl. You had ascended to the assembly rooms. The rooms were already nearly full. The country dance was in progress on the floor. The orchestra was playing. The patronesses were assembled in their usual seats at one end of the room with the older matrons around them, and the chairs along the walls were occupied by the seated company who were not currently dancing. Your dance card for the evening was as usual fully filled, and your first partner, who was a young captain of the guards, was already approaching to claim you for the country dance that would begin in about 10 minutes. You curtsied to the patronesses. You took your seat for a moment beside your mother. You exchanged a few words with the young woman seated to your right, who was your friend Caroline, who had also been admitted to Almack's that season. You watched the dance in progress on the floor. The captain came over. The first dance was announced. You took the floor. The country dance lasted 20 minutes or so, in the long lines of couples that the dance required, with the figures progressing up and down the line in the pattern that any well-trained debutante could follow. You exchanged the small courteous remarks with the captain that the dance permitted. You returned to your seat. The captain bowed and departed to claim his next partner. The second dance was announced. Your second partner, who was a young viscount of moderate consequence, came to claim you. The second dance proceeded similarly. By the third dance, which was a quadrille, the rhythm of the evening was settled. You had been in the room for an hour. You had danced 3 times. You had drunk a small glass of lemonade. You had exchanged perhaps 4 sentences with each of 3 different partners. The watching of the room was continuous and inevitable. You were, in essence, performing the role of Diamond at Almack's, in the middle of the season, on a perfectly ordinary Wednesday evening, with the practiced ease that the previous weeks had given you. The supper interval came at 1 o'clock. The supper at Almack's was, as I have mentioned, dreadful. Bread and butter, stale cake, lemonade, a few small biscuits. The supper room was less an actual supper than a small refreshment between the first and second halves of the dancing. You were handed down to supper by your fourth partner of the evening, who was the gentleman whom you had marked in your dance card management for that particular Wednesday as the recipient of your supper attention. You sat with him, and with several other couples at the same table, for perhaps half an hour. The conversation was light. Nothing of consequence was said by anyone. The company returned to the ballroom. The dancing resumed. By 2:30, you had danced 8 times. You were tired. Your mother was making the small gesture toward you across the room that meant the carriage would soon be ordered, and the evening was approaching its conclusion. You left at 3. The carriage took you home through the empty streets of Mayfair. You climbed the stairs to your bedroom. Sarah took down the hair, removed the gown, brought you a glass of water. You were in your nightgown by 3:15. You slept until almost noon. The next day the morning calls began. The visitors were received. The carriage drive in the park took place. The evening's ball was attended. The week continued. The season continued, and the rhythm, monotonous and exhausting, and somehow also irreplaceable, repeated itself week after week, until the closing of London and the journey home returned you to the country and to the new chapter of your life that was, by then, beginning to take shape on the horizon. I want to mention, before we close, the letters home. The letters home from a young woman in the middle of her season are, when they survive, among the most valuable historical documents we have for understanding what the experience actually felt like. Most of them have not survived. Most of them were thrown away by their recipients within a generation, or were lost in house moves, or were burned in the routine clearing out of accumulated paper that family households conduct every decade or so. But some have survived in family archives and in the papers of country houses that have not been disturbed for 2 centuries, and the picture they give us of the inner experience of the season is considerably more complex and more honest than the public surface of the era's social writing suggests. You wrote letters to Elizabeth in Devonshire twice a week. You wrote letters to your grandmother in Scotland once a fortnight. You wrote letters to your married sister, whose own first child had been born the previous year, perhaps once a week. The letters were sealed with wax, addressed in your own hand, and given to the footman to take to the post. The post in 1814 was reasonably efficient by the standards of the era. Your letter to Elizabeth in Devonshire would arrive at the family's country house within 3 or 4 days. Her reply would arrive in London within a week of your having sent the letter. The whole correspondence, by the middle of the season, had developed a rhythm, with both of you replying on particular days of the week, so that the letters would cross at predictable intervals. The letters were, in their content, considerably more honest than anything you said in the drawing rooms. You wrote to Elizabeth about the gentleman whom you found dull, but whose family consequence required that you be civil to him. You wrote about the patroness whom you found rather frightening, but whose approval was important. You wrote about the supper at Carlton House, with rather more candour than you would have used in talking about it at a drawing-room afterward. You wrote about Caroline, who had become your closest companion in town. You wrote about the gowns, the slippers, the small frustrations of the dressing, the particular pin that Sarah had ordered from a haberdasher in Bond Street that turned out to be exactly the wrong size. You wrote about the letter from your brother, who was on his way home from his regiment in France, who would not be back in London until after the season had ended. You wrote about the small private griefs and the small private pleasures that no one in fashionable London would have heard you mention. These letters were, in some sense, the only place in your season where the private young woman behind the diamond was permitted to speak in her own voice. Everywhere else, the public character had to be on duty. In the letters, you were yourself. The letters were, accordingly, the part of the day's labour that you most looked forward to. Sitting at the small writing desk in your bedroom, with the ink and the paper and the candle, in the quarter hour before the dressing began, was by the middle of the season a small pocket of recovered selfhood that you protected with a fierceness you might not have entirely articulated to yourself. Elizabeth, on her side of the correspondence, was the recipient of a kind of confidence that she understood to be precious, and her replies, when they came, treated the confidences with the gravity they deserved. the friendship that those letters sustained across the 4 months of your separation that spring would survive the rest of your life. Elizabeth would, in due course, marry a clergyman in Devonshire and would be the rector's wife in a small parish on the edge of the moor. You would, in due course, be the viscountess in your great house in Worcestershire. The letters between the rectory and the great house would continue twice a month for the next 50 years. When Elizabeth died in 1862, the news would reach you in a letter from her eldest daughter, and you would weep for an afternoon in the morning room of your house, in a way that you had not wept since the death of your husband 11 years before. The friendships made in particular kinds of stress, you would reflect afterward, were friendships that nothing else could replace. Elizabeth had known, when no one else had really known, what the spring of 1814 had felt like to live through. With her gone, the witness was gone. The season existed now only in your own memory, with no one else who could confirm or amplify what you remembered. The loneliness of being. Finally, the only one left who had been there was a particular small late grief that the Diamond did not entirely anticipate when she was 18, but that she would eventually come to recognize as one of the costs of having lived a long life. The closing of London at the end of July was, in itself, an event of particular character that I want to spend some time with, because the experience of leaving the city at the end of a season was different from the experience of arriving in it, and the difference said something important about what the season had done to you. The great houses of Mayfair began their closing in the last week of July. The dust covers came out. The chandeliers were lowered and wrapped. The plate was returned to the strong room. The carpets were rolled up and stored against the moths. The shutters were closed. The knockers were taken off the doors, the visible signal that the household was no longer receiving callers. The footmen were given their instructions for the long quiet months until the family returned in the new year. The whole apparatus that had been so carefully assembled in April was being disassembled in August, in reverse, with the same servants doing the same work in the opposite direction. For your family, the closing was complicated by the fact of the engagement. The Viscount's family had been informed. Your husband-to-be had begun his own preparations for the arrangements that the marriage would require. The lawyers were exchanging the first drafts of the marriage settlement. The autumn would be busy with these preparations. But the immediate task in the first days of August was simply to remove yourselves from London and return to the country, where the quieter rhythms of the late summer would allow the necessary work to proceed at a more sustainable pace. The journey to Hertfordshire took 2 days. The carriage left the door of the London house at 7 in the morning. Your mother had supervised the loading of the trunks the previous evening. The footman had handed the last of the small items into the carriage with the particular care that the long journey required. You sat with your mother in the carriage as the horses pulled away from the curb. You looked back, once, at the house in which you had spent the strangest 4 months of your life so far. The shutters were already closed on the upper floors. The knocker had been removed. The house, which had hummed with activity and light for the entire spring, was already settling into its long quiet. Within an hour, the carriage was clear of London and rolling along the post road north, with the green of the early August fields stretching out on either side, with the slow, steady progress of the horses, with the small breeze that was the first tolerable air you had breathed in weeks. The country, when you arrived, looked exactly as you had left it in April. The same gates, the same drive, the same servants assembling at the front door to greet your return. But you, who were arriving back into it, were not the same person who had departed. The Diamond who came back to Hertfordshire in August of 1814 was not the same young woman who had left it in April. She had seen things she had not seen before. She had stood in rooms she had not previously imagined. She had been observed by the eye of the highest society in England, and that society had returned, in its fragmented and elusive way, a verdict. The verdict, by the time the carriage rolled through the gates of the country house at the end of the long August day, was clear. The season had succeeded. The Diamond had become engaged. The next chapter was beginning. The autumn at the country house was, By every account, the part of the year that the women who had been diamonds remembered with particular fondness. The pace was slower, the visitors were familiar. The weather was the soft, late summer weather of the English countryside in its best season. You walked in the garden in the mornings. You sat with your mother in the morning room in the afternoons, going through the lists of items that needed to be ordered for the wedding and for your future household. You wrote long letters to your husband-to-be, who was managing his own end of the preparations from his estate in Worcestershire. The letters between you, which were the first letters you had been permitted to exchange directly without family supervision, now that the engagement was formal, were a new kind of writing for both of you. They were tentative at first, then warmer still. By September, you were corresponding with him in a tone that suggested you had begun to develop an actual interest in him as a person, separate from his consequence as a match. He came to visit twice in the autumn. He stayed for 3 nights each time, in the guest bedroom at the far end of the house, in the kind of carefully chaperoned arrangement that the etiquette of an engaged couple required. You walked with him in the gardens. You sat with him in the drawing room with your mother and your aunt nearby. You ate dinner with him at the family table, with the small, intimate atmosphere of a country dinner that the great house permitted at this time of year. You began, slowly, to know him. He was, you discovered, considerably shyer than his season conduct had suggested. He was also kinder, in small ways that the public manner of the season had not been able to display. He worried about his tenants. He was attached to a particular dog at his estate that had recently grown old. He had a younger brother of whom he was very fond, who had served in the Navy through the war and was now home for the first time in years, and whose welcome back was for him one of the great quiet pleasures of that summer. The man who emerged in those autumn visits was a man whose interior you had not been able to see at all in the crowded rooms of London. The interior was, you discovered, considerably more interesting than the exterior had been able to suggest. By the time of the wedding, you were no longer the young woman who had accepted his offer in the morning room in late July, out of a kind of relieved exhaustion. You were a young woman who, while still not in love with him in the romantic sense, had begun to like him in the deeper sense that the early stages of a real attachment require. The wedding, when it came, was held at the parish church of your country home in Hertfordshire on a clear morning in late September. The wedding of a diamond was not, in 1814, the elaborate public ceremony that the modern imagination, conditioned by Victorian and 20th century weddings, expects. The Regency wedding, even at the highest levels of society, was a small, quiet family affair. 25 guests in the church, the bride's parents, the groom's parents, the immediate siblings, a few close cousins, 2 or 3 particular friends. The bride wore a gown that was only slightly more elaborate than her best evening dress. White was popular, but not yet universal. Yours was pale silver, made by Madame Lanchester, with a small headdress of orange blossom. The groom wore the formal day dress that the occasion required. The vicar, who had baptized you 21 years before, performed the ceremony. The vows were spoken. The register was signed in the vestry afterward. The wedding breakfast, which was actually held at midday, was eaten in the dining room of your parents' house, which had been arranged by your mother with the particular care that this final occasion of her active management of your social life required. By 3 in the afternoon, you and the Viscount, who was now your husband, were in his carriage, on the way to his family estate in Worcestershire, where the rest of his family was waiting to receive you. The journey took 2 days. You stopped overnight at a coaching inn in Oxfordshire, in the kind of arrangement that the era's discreet handling of such matters had refined to a workable etiquette. You arrived at his estate on the evening of the 2nd day. His mother received you at the door of the great house. The household had been assembled in the front hall to greet the new mistress, in the formal arrangement of butler, housekeeper, footman, maids, that the establishment of a great country house required. You were introduced. You said the small formal phrases that were appropriate. You went up to your room, which was the room that the previous Viscountess, your husband's grandmother, had occupied for 50 years before her death, and which had been redecorated for you in the past month with a care that suggested how much your husband's family had been prepared, all along, to welcome you. Sarah, who had come ahead with the trunks, was already there. The fire was lit. The room was warm. You sat down on the edge of the bed and burst into tears very briefly in the way that an exhausted person sometimes does when they reach, finally, a place of safety. Sarah, who had seen you through the entire season, said only, "There now," and brought you a cup of tea. The marriage had begun. The first months of marriage for you were a transition that the season had not entirely prepared you for. You were now mistress of an establishment. You had a household to manage, with its housekeeper and its butler and its dozen indoor servants. You had your husband's family to know, in the slow way that a new wife comes to know her in-laws, with the conversations after dinner, and the walks in the gardens, and the quiet questions over breakfast about how things had been done in the previous generation. You had your husband himself, with whom you were now embarked on the long collaborative project of making a marriage. The Viscount turned out, in those early months, to be a reserved but thoughtful young man with a good deal more depth than his seasoned conduct had suggested. He read more than you had expected. He was interested in agricultural improvement and was making careful changes to the management of his estate. He wrote letters to his agents in his own hand, which was unusual for a man of his rank, and he was meticulous about the conditions of his tenants. He was also, in the privacy of married life, unfailingly courteous to you, and slowly, in the way that such things grow, you began to be genuinely fond of him. The first child arrived 11 months after the wedding, a daughter whose health was a matter of considerable anxiety for the first year, and who turned out, after that year, to be a robust and lively child. 2 more children followed in the next 4 years, both sons. The household at the country estate became, by the time you were 25, the kind of full and busy establishment that demanded your attention from morning till evening. The season, which you continued to attend with your husband for the first several years of your marriage, became a less central feature of your life. You went up to London for the parliamentary session each year. You attended the events that were necessary. But the diamond who had occupied the rooms of London in the spring of 1814 became, by 1820, a memory rather than a present fact. You were a viscountess. You were a mother. You were the chatelaine of an estate. The young woman who had stood in the doorway of the ballroom, with her plumes and her gloves and her perfectly white dancing slippers, was somewhere inside you still, but she had become a kind of ghost, summoned only on particular occasions. When an old acquaintance from the season caught your eye across a London room, and the two of you exchanged the small private smile that your shared history permitted. But here is what I want to leave you with, before we close. The diamond, in her later life, will remember her season more vividly than she will remember almost any other period of her young adulthood. She will remember the particular weight of the gloves, the precise feel of the slippers, the smell of the wax of the candles in the rooms at Almack's, the way the particular gentleman, whose name you can guess, turned to look at her when she came into the supper room at the ball at Devonshire House. She will remember, even when she is 60 and living in a house in the country, and has not been to London for a season in 30 years, the specific quality of having been, for one strange spring, the woman every other woman in town was watching. She will not, in most cases, want it back. The cost was too high, and the freedom of being older and unwatched is, when she finally has it, one of the great, quiet pleasures of her later life. But she will remember it, and when, occasionally, in a country drawing room in the 1840s, she finds herself in conversation with another woman of her own age, who is looking at her with a particular expression, the expression of someone who has just realized something about the older woman opposite. She will know what is happening. The younger woman has worked out who she was. the diamond of 1814, the famous one, the one whose name was in all the columns. And the older woman, who is now grey-haired and sits with a piece of needlework on her lap and a small dog asleep at her feet, will smile slightly and not quite confirm it, and the conversation will move on. The season will, briefly, have come back into the room, and it will, just as briefly, leave again. There is a particular small quality of recognition between women who were diamonds in their youth that does not, on the whole, exist between women who were not. They know what each other went through. They do not need to discuss it. The friendships that are formed in late life between women who shared the experience of being elevated in their youth are, by every account, particularly close. They have a vocabulary that does not need to be explained. They have the same ghosts. They have in their separate marriages and their separate mature lives navigated the particular long aftermath of having peaked in some sense at 18, and they know what that aftermath looks like from inside. The friendships are quiet. They are conducted in old age through correspondence and occasional visits. They sustain a kind of secret society of women who 2 centuries before any modern celebrity culture had been invented, had had an experience that the modern celebrity would recognize immediately, and who had carried the experience into their old age with the dignity and the small private fatigue that the experience produces in anyone who has lived it. Now I want to ask you something, and it gently, because I think the question is the most useful thing the Diamond story has to offer to anyone who is encountering it tonight. Have you ever, at any point in your own life, in any version of your own circumstances, found yourself unexpectedly singled out, selected by some combination of timing and luck and qualities you cannot quite name, to receive a degree of attention that you had not been expecting? It need not have been romantic attention. It might have been professional. It might have been social. Most of us have had a version of this, at some scale, at some point. The scale of the Diamond situation was very large. The structure of it is, in its essentials, recognizable to almost anyone who has ever experienced even a much smaller version of being placed, briefly, at the center of a room that was watching. What did you do with it? How did you manage the gap between the version of yourself that was being attended to and that you actually were? How did you sleep in those nights when the attention was at its peak? How did you survive the slow resumption of ordinary life when the moment eventually ended? Did you keep any friends from the period before, the friends who had known you when you were not the center of anything? Did you make any new friends from the period after, who could only see you in the light of the visibility you had had? These are not questions I am asking you to answer. They are questions I am asking you to sit with while you fall asleep, in the company of a young woman in 1814 who found herself in a version of the same situation 2 centuries before you. She did not know your name. You do not know hers, but she went through, in her white gown and her carriage drives and her midnight returns from balls, something that you, in your own version of being seen, may have a private understanding of: the gap between the public image and the private self, the exhaustion of perpetual self-presentation, the particular loneliness that comes when everyone in the room is interested in you, and almost no one is interested in the actual you, the way friendships fray when one person becomes more visible than the others, the way attention, however flattering, costs something that is not always paid back. She is, I want to suggest, a sister of yours, across that long distance. A different woman, in a different era, with a different vocabulary and a different costume, but a sister nonetheless. The conditions under which she lived made her experience of being singled out unusually concentrated, unusually structured, unusually visible. But the experience itself, in its inner texture, is part of a long human story that does not belong only to 1814. There is one more thought I want to offer before the closing image, because it sits at the heart of why I think the Diamond story still has something to give us. The architecture of attention in any era has a particular shape. It selects certain people by mechanisms that are partly mysterious and partly governed by the particular machinery of that era's social system, and elevates them, briefly, to a position of concentrated visibility. The mechanisms change. The elevation does not. In 1814, the mechanism was the patronesses of Almack's, the bow window of White's, the columns of the Morning Post, the print shops in St. James's Street. In 2026, the mechanism is the algorithm, the platform, the sudden viral post, the hundreds of thousands of strangers responding to a fragment of someone's life that they have offered up without quite knowing what would happen. The shape is the same. The attention is the same. There is a particular kind of wisdom that comes from having been at the center of such an elevation and survived it. The diamond of 1814, in her old age, knew things that the woman who had never been a diamond did not know. She knew in a way that the unelevated could not quite know what attention costs. She knew what it does to friendships. She knew that the elevation itself, however dazzling at the moment, was a passage rather than a destination, and that the longer life that followed it would have its own meanings, separate from the visibility that had marked the months at its center. This knowledge was, in its quiet way, valuable. It made her, in her old age, a wiser woman than she would otherwise have been. It made her sometimes the person to whom younger women could come in confused moments of their own visibility and find a kind of reassurance that less experienced confidants could not offer. If you have ever been, however briefly, at the center of attention that you did not invite, you will recognize the shape of what I am describing. The diamond season was an extreme version of an experience that, in attenuated forms, runs through almost every life. The gift of the story, 2 centuries on, is that it allows us to recognize our own smaller versions of the same passage, in the company of a young woman whose version of it is now safely in the past and can be looked at without the particular distortions that being in the middle of one's own version produces. Let me leave you with one more image before I let you go to sleep. It is 11:30 on a Tuesday evening in late June of 1814. You are standing on the staircase of a great house in Grosvenor Square, just inside the door of the ballroom, having paused for one brief second before going in. The orchestra is playing the first dance. The room is full. You can see from where you stand the host and hostess receiving by the inner door, and the gentlemen along the far wall who have already, in the half-second since you appeared at the entrance, registered your arrival, and the small turning of heads that has begun to ripple along the edges of the room. Your mother is one step behind you. Your gloves are perfectly white. The plumes in your hair are exactly the height they should be. The pearl drop at your throat is the one your father gave you for your 16th birthday, and you have worn it every evening of the season because it is small and quiet and reminds you when you touch it of who you were before any of this began. You have a single second before you must go forward into the room in which you are not yet on display. The hostess has not yet seen you. The gentlemen who will come for their dances have not yet caught your eye. The patroness who will nod approvingly across the room has not yet completed the small movement of recognition. The orchestra is between phrases. The candles are throwing their slightly trembling light onto the silk of your gown and the silver of the small embroidery at the hem. You are, for one breath, just yourself, standing in a doorway. And in that one breath, you can feel very clearly the doubleness of your situation. The diamond, who is about to enter the room, with all her confidence and her smile, and her impeccable plumes and her dance card, and her attention to every gesture. And the young woman who is standing here, simply tired, simply nervous, simply hopeful, simply uncertain about what is going to happen to her in the next 4 weeks of the season. The two of you take a breath together. You step forward into the ballroom. The hostess sees you. The orchestra continues. The evening in all its brightness and all its weight begins. That is the picture I want to leave you with tonight. The young woman in the doorway. The breath before the entrance. The two selves, the public and the private, briefly aligned in the small dark second before the room sees her. Around her, in the houses of London, dozens of other young women are also standing in doorways, also taking their breath, also beginning their evenings. None of them are quite where she is. Most of them, in some quieter way, are facing their own version of the same step. The light from the chandeliers spills out of the open ballroom doors and catches on the white silk of her gown. She steps forward, and somewhere, 212 years later, in a room she could not possibly have imagined, in a country she might never have heard of, a person she did not know existed is listening to her story and falling asleep to it. That is, in its way, what she gave us, the picture of one young woman in a doorway, in a particular spring, in a particular year, on the threshold of an evening that would, she suspected, be remembered. 2 centuries on, we are honouring the suspicion. The evening has, in fact, been remembered, not in the form she might have expected, but remembered all the same. The diamond of 1814 is gone now. Her grandchildren are gone. Her great-grandchildren are gone. The house in Mayfair where she lived during her seasons has been demolished or rebuilt, or is still standing but lived in by people who have no idea who occupied it 2 centuries ago. The estate she went to as a Viscountess has in many cases passed to other families, or been sold to pay death duties, or been opened to the public as a National Trust property, whose visitors walk through her drawing room in their afternoon clothes and read the small notices that describe the room without quite mentioning her by name. The pearl drop her father gave her has, in all probability, been broken up and reset, or sold, or lost in a house move, or buried with a granddaughter who valued it for its sentimental rather than its commercial worth. The dance card she carried in her reticule on the night of the Carlton house ball has certainly been thrown away, or has crumbled in an attic, or survives, perhaps, in some archive somewhere, identified only as a card from an unknown season that names on it long since, meaning nothing to anyone living. And yet she is, tonight, in the room with you. The structure of attention that she went through has been described. The small private moments of her exhaustion have been considered. The doorway in which she stood, on a Tuesday evening in 1814, with her plumes and her gloves has been imagined. In your room, in the soft light of whatever lamp is illuminating the place where you are now, she is, in some quiet sense, not gone. The story of her, even if not the historical fact of her, has reached you, and the reaching is, perhaps, the small modest answer to the question of what becomes of any of us. In the end, we do not stay. We are not preserved. The objects we carry do not, in most cases, survive us. The houses we lived in are torn down or passed to other people, but the shape of what we went through, when it was true, and when it was carefully observed, kindly remembered, can sometimes find its way, 2 centuries on, into the room of a stranger, and sit there for an hour, and offer something that the stranger needed, and leave again with the small dignity of a guest who has been welcome. Sleep well. Hold the picture of the doorway if it helps. Hold the picture of the young woman with her gloves and her plumes, taking her breath before she went in. Hold, if it is useful, the picture of her at 60, with her grey hair and her piece of needlework, in a country drawing room in 1856, recognizing in another woman across the room the small particular quality that only the women who were once diamonds carry with them into their old age. The diamond's experience does not end with the diamond. It continues, it deepens, it becomes in time a kind of quiet wisdom that the woman herself did not, when she was 18, suspect she was acquiring. Be kind tomorrow to anyone you encounter who is trying in their own way to manage the gap between the version of themselves that the world is looking at and the version they actually live inside. We are, all of us, working on a version of that problem. The diamond of 1814 was working on it too. She would, I think, be pleased to know that we still remember. She would also be pleased, I think, to know that the remembering is being done 2 centuries on, in the kind of gentle attention that the original season did not always make available to her. We are looking at her now with a kindness that her own watchers did not always extend. The watching has, in this particular small respect, improved. I will see you in the next one.